At 20,000 feet over Guadalcanal, a U.S. pilot is hunted by a Japanese Zero. His Wildcat shudders like a flying coffin. Cannon fire tears through the cockpit. He falls into shark-infested waters. This is the Pacific Air War. And weeks later, an overage farm boy will enter that sky and turn the hunters into prey. That sky had a reputation. Guadalcanal wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a grinder. A place where American pilots were fed into combat one by one and chewed apart. The men who flew there had a name, the Cactus Air Force. The press said it with pride. The pilots said it like a warning. They called their base Henderson Field, the graveyard. The enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was the math of the air. American Wildcats were heavy, slow to respond, armored like trucks. The Japanese Zero was the opposite, light, agile, able to turn inside almost anything the U.S. could throw at it. For a year, it ruled the Pacific skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Veteran Japanese pilots knew it. They baited Americans into turns, waited for the Wildcat to bleed speed, then struck. Back in the States, the doctrine was simple: never turn with a Zero. Dive, shoot, run. On paper, it made sense. Over Guadalcanal and swirling chaotic dogfights, it was getting men killed every single day. Survival wasn't victory, it was just delay. And yet, unknown to everyone in that burning sky, the solution was already on its way across the Pacific. Not a new aircraft, not a new order from Washington. Just a stubborn 27-year-old farm boy from South Dakota about to step into the deadliest airspace on Earth and fight the war the only way he knew how, like a hunter. Before he ever faced a Zero, before Guadalcanal burned his name into history, Joe Foss was fighting a different enemy: poverty, cold, time itself. He wasn't born into uniforms or academies. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota. No paved roads, no safety nets. His childhood wasn't shaped by classrooms or textbooks. It was shaped by wind that cut through your coat dirt, that cracked under drought, and a sky that never cared how hard you worked. When the Great Depression hit, South Dakota collapsed. Crops failed, livestock died, money vanished. Survival wasn't a goal, it was a daily calculation. Joe Foss learned early that nothing was wasted, especially effort. If the family was going to eat, someone had to hunt. That's where the secret was born. As a boy, Foss hunted jackrabbits with an old shotgun, no scope, no luxury. His father gave him one rule: don't waste shells. A jackrabbit doesn't run straight. It zigzags, jukes, reverses. If you aimed at where it was, you'd miss every time. To hit it, you had to aim where it would be. Foss learned to calculate speed, angle, and timing in a heartbeat. He wasn't guessing. He was predicting. While other kids memorize formulas, Joe Foss was training his brain to solve moving problems at lethal speed. He wanted to fly, badly. At 18, he saw Marine pilots roaring overhead at an air show and told his father, "That's what I'm going to do." But life intervened. His father was killed in a tragic accident. Joe dropped out of school to run the farm. The dream didn't die, it just went underground. For 6 years, he worked by day and studied by night. He washed dishes to pay for flying lessons. He clawed his way toward the sky, one exhausted step at a time. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked. Joe Foss was 26. He ran to enlist as a fighter pilot and was rejected. Too old. Regulations said 25 was the cutoff. The experts told him his war would be teaching other young men how to fly, then watching them go die. They thought it was the end of the story. They didn't understand farmers. Because Joe Foss didn't quit. He looked for the flaw. And like he always had, he found it. Joe Foss didn't argue with the experts. He outmaneuvered them. If the Navy said he was too old to fight, he'd find another door. Foss joined the Marine Corps Reserve, slipping through a loophole the paperwork men hadn't closed yet. They made him an instructor. For 9 long months, he trained boys barely old enough to shave 20-year-olds who called him sir and trusted him with their lives. Then he watched them ship out to the Pacific. Many never came back. It ate at him. Foss wrote letters. He complained. He demanded combat duty again and again. He later said he became the loudest, most annoying instructor the Navy ever had. Eventually, just to shut him up, they relented. Advanced Fighter Training. A combat assignment. VMF 121. In October 1942, while Marion Carl was being blasted out of the sky, Joe Foss, 27 years old, already labeled too old, was loading onto a transport ship bound for Guadalcanal. Nothing prepared him for what he found. Henderson Field wasn't a base. It was a scar carved out of jungle. The air reeked of fuel rot and death. The runway was dirt and gravel chewed to pieces by constant bombing. The operations center was a wooden shack. The pilots lived in mud-floored tents. And everywhere were wrecks. Dozens of shattered aircraft shoved to the edges of the field, wings torn off, engines split open, cockpits stained dark. This wasn't storage, this was evidence. The men he met weren't fresh recruits. They were hollow-eyed veterans, skin yellowed by atabrine hands shaking from exhaustion and malaria. They didn't greet Foss like a reinforcement. They looked at him like replacement meat. Then he saw his plane, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Heavy, slow, rugged, but hopelessly outclassed by the Zero. Pilots called it a flying coffin. Foss ran his hand along the metal anyway. He'd driven trucks tougher than this back home. The briefing was short. The rule was absolute. Never turn with a Zero. Foss nodded. He understood the rule. But in his mind, he saw snow, wind, a jackrabbit cutting hard left. And he realized something none of the manuals ever had. Rules were written by men who had never hunted. Joe Foss's first flight over Guadalcanal wasn't a warm-up. It was a test, and the sky wasted no time administering it. He climbed to altitude in his Wildcat, the engine vibrating through the seat, the horizon in endless blue. The veterans had warned him. They come out of the sun. You never see them until it's already too late. Foss scanned the sky, feeling blind, exposed. This wasn't the open prairie. There was nowhere to hide. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Foss looked up and his stomach tightened. Zeros, diving fast, too fast. Their wings flashed silver as they fell out of the sun like knives. Instinct screamed at him to turn to fight, but the rule echoed louder. Never turn with a Zero. He shoved the stick forward and dove. The Wildcat picked up speed, howling, as the jungle rushed up to meet him. Tracers streaked past his canopy. 1-0 stayed glued to his tail, patient, confident. Foss kept diving until the treetops blurred, then pulled out hard and ran for home. He landed alive. But he wasn't satisfied. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from fury. The doctrine had worked. He survived. But nothing else changed. The Zeros were still there. Tomorrow they'd be back. Running wasn't winning. It was waiting to die later. Days later, the sky gave him another chance. Japanese bombers appeared over the island, escorted by Zeros. The fight exploded instantly. Wildcats and Zeros twisting, diving, crossing at lethal speed. Foss saw a Zero lining up behind one of his wingmen, closing in for the kill. The rule said, dive away, save yourself. The farmer said otherwise. Foss rolled hard and didn't aim at the Zero. He aimed at nothing, empty sky, far ahead of it. He pulled the trigger and held it down. A long, steady burst. It looked wrong, wasteful. The Japanese pilot never saw it coming. Locked onto his target, committed to the turn, the Zero flew straight into the stream of .50 caliber fire. The wing tore off. The aircraft vanished in a flash of flame and debris. Silence filled Foss's cockpit. He hadn't outturned the Zero. He hadn't outrun it. He had outthought it. When he landed, the ghosts of Henderson Field gathered around him. Foss looked at his battered Wildcat and grinned. "This thing's a truck," he said, "but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." The hunt had begun. In a place like Henderson Field, nothing stayed secret for long. By nightfall, every pilot on the island had heard what Joe Foss had done. A Wildcat had turned with a Zero and survived. Men who had spent weeks watching friends die leaned in as Foss explained it, tracing invisible arcs through the air with his finger. "Don't chase them. Don't aim at the airplane. Aim at the space it's about to steal. Lead it until it feels wrong. Then lead it more." They were desperate enough to listen. Foss was soon given a small flight of Wildcats, 8 planes in total. They weren't the best. They were the leftovers. New arrivals, replacements, men who hadn't lasted long enough to become ghosts yet. No one expected miracles from them, not even command. When reporters saw this mismatched group following the tall farm boy into combat, they gave them a name: Foss's Flying Circus. On October 16th, the circus went to work. 8 Wildcats climbed into a sky already crowded with enemy aircraft. 32 Japanese planes were inbound, Zeros among them. 4-to-1 odds. On paper, it was suicide. Foss didn't hesitate. He paired his pilots off, ordering them into a tight weave, each man guarding the other's blind spot. If a Zero attacked one, it would expose itself to the other. The formation wasn't elegant, but it was deadly. Foss led the dive. He spotted a Zero, calculated its path, and fired before instinct said he should. The enemy aircraft flew straight into the stream of .50 caliber rounds and disintegrated. Almost instantly, another Zero dropped onto Foss's tail, but his wingman was already there, rolling over and cutting it down. The fight became a rhythm. Attack, cover, lead, fire. Wildcats protecting Wildcats. Zeros dying in mid-turn. 10 minutes later, it was over. 5 Japanese aircraft were gone. All 8 American planes came home. For the first time, the graveyard was winning. The kill board filled faster than anyone believed possible. October 18th, 2 more. October 20th, another. By October 20th, Joe Foss was officially an ace. 5 victories in 10 days. The 2-old farmer from South Dakota had become the most dangerous man in the sky over Guadalcanal. And success, like smoke, never stays invisible for long. Japanese pilots began hearing one name repeated in radio intercepts: Foss. The Wildcat that didn't run. The American who fired at empty sky and somehow made it lethal. What had once been sport for veteran Zero pilots was becoming something else entirely. They weren't hunting Wildcats anymore. They were hunting Joe Foss. When the enemy learns your name, the war changes. By late October, The Japanese weren't just fighting wildcats anymore, they were hunting Foss. Veteran Zero pilots were reassigned. Tactics shifted. Traps were set. Guadalcanal's sky, already deadly, became personal. On November 7th, it nearly ended. Foss was leading his flight when the attack came out of nowhere, an elite group of Japanese aces, diving hard, fast, and coordinated. The sky exploded into chaos. Tracers stitched the air. Engines screamed. Foss fought on instinct, now the farmer's math running faster than thought. He lined up 2 zeros and cut them down in quick succession. Then he felt the UDAR. Cannon fire ripped into his Wildcat from behind. The engine detonated. Smoke filled the cockpit. Controls went slack. The plane was dying. Foss didn't panic. He rode it down until the last second, then bailed out, tumbling into the jungle as his Wildcat slammed into the trees below. He hit the ground hard, but alive, shaken, bruised, breathing. They pulled him out before nightfall. Any other pilot would have been done. 2 days later, Foss was back in the air. This time he was chasing a Japanese float plane over open water. Focus narrowed. The kill was almost his. He never saw the rear gunner. The burst came fast. The engine shattered. For the second time in 3 days, Foss's plane was dead. But now there was no jungle beneath him, only ocean. He ditched hard. The Wildcat sank in under 30 seconds. Foss surfaced alone 10 miles from land, drifting in one of the most shark-infested waters on Earth. The Pacific was quiet, too quiet. Then he saw the fins. They circled, bumped him, tested him. Foss treaded water for hours, muscles burning, heart hammering. He had no weapon, no radio, just patience. The same patience he'd learned waiting in frozen fields for game to move. 4 hours later, salvation appeared, a canoe. Native islanders sent by an Australian coast watcher who had spotted the crash, beat the water with their paddles, and scared the sharks off. They dragged Foss aboard hypothermic and barely conscious. Back at Henderson Field, the doctors grounded him immediately. Malaria, exposure, exhaustion. The flying circus would fly without him. The Japanese heard the rumors soon after. Joe Foss was dead. For the first time in weeks, the sky over Guadalcanal felt quieter. But ghosts don't stay buried for long. For a while, Joe Foss's trick seemed unstoppable. Zeros kept dying, Wildcats kept coming home. And the sky over Guadalcanal slowly began to feel predictable. That's when it almost killed him. Late one afternoon, Foss dove on a lone zero that looked careless, too high, too slow, too exposed. It was the kind of setup he had punished dozens of times before. Foss calculated the lead, aimed at empty sky, and fired. Nothing happened. The zero didn't turn where it was supposed to. It didn't commit. Instead, it snapped into a brutal vertical maneuver Foss hadn't seen before. In a split second, the roles reversed. Tracers ripped past Foss's canopy. His Wildcat shuddered as rounds punched through the wings. For the first time since arriving on Guadalcanal, Joe Foss realized something terrifying. The enemy was learning. The Japanese pilot wasn't baiting a turn. He was baiting the lead. He had watched Wildcats fire into empty space before. He had seen friends die that way. And now he was countering it, forcing Foss to commit early, then changing the fight at the last possible moment. Foss broke hard, barely escaping with his life. He limped back to Henderson Field, his plane torn up his hands, shaking not from fear, but from clarity. The trick wasn't magic. It was timing, and timing could be beaten. That night, Foss didn't sleep. He sat alone, replaying the fight over and over. The farmer's eye adjusted again. If the enemy was learning to fake the future, Foss would stop relying on patterns. He would hunt the pilot, not the plane. Read intent, read hesitation, read fear. By morning, the trick had evolved. And when Joe Foss took off again, he wasn't just ahead of the zero. He was ahead of the man flying it. Joe Foss didn't die in the ocean, but Guadalcanal tried again anyway. For 2 weeks, he lay in a hospital bed shaking with fever, his body soaked in sweat one moment and racked with chills the next. Malaria clawed at him from the inside. Doctors told him the truth. If he went back up, it could kill him. His flying circus was still fighting. Zeros were still coming. And Foss was trapped on the ground, staring at a ceiling, while the hunt went on without him. The Japanese believed the rumors. The wildcat that wouldn't run was gone. The farmer who fired at empty sky was finished. Confidence crept back into their cockpits. They were wrong. Joe Foss recovered the only way he knew how, by refusing not to. He dragged himself out of bed before the doctors cleared him. Lost weight, yellow skin, hollow eyes. He barely looked like the man who had terrorized the skies weeks earlier. But when he climbed into a new wildcat, something familiar came back online. The fever blurred his vision. The farm sharpened his instincts. On November 30th, Foss went hunting again. The first zero never saw him. Foss fired a short, precise burst, and the Japanese fighter fell away in flames. The radio crackled. Pilots who thought they were fighting ghosts now realized the ghost was real and angry. The Japanese threw everything they had at him. Elite pilots, coordinated attacks, ambushes. Foss kept flying through it all, his body failing while his mind stayed lethal. By January 1943, his score stood at 23. He was 3 kills away from a number every American pilot knew by heart. 26. The record set in World War I by Eddie Rickenbacker. Untouchable, sacred. A mountain no one had climbed in over 20 years. Joe Foss was 27 years old, flying with malaria, in a plane everyone said was inferior. And he was climbing that mountain anyway. Every landing crew saw the same thing. A wildcat punch full of holes, Foss shaking uncontrollably from fever as they lifted him out of the cockpit. He was fighting 2 wars now, one in the sky, one in his blood. And somehow, he was winning both. The sky over Guadalcanal was about to witness the breaking of a legend. And Joe Foss would do it the only way he ever had, by ignoring the rules and trusting the hunt. January 15, 1943, began with an order Joe Foss had no intention of obeying. He was burning with fever, weaker than he had ever been, his body shaking from malaria. The doctors grounded him on the spot. Foss listened, nodded, and waited until they were gone. When word came in that a massive Japanese convoy, the Tokyo Express, was racing toward Guadalcanal under heavy fighter cover, he knew where he belonged. He dragged himself to the flight line and climbed into his Wildcat. By the time he reached altitude, the sky was already alive. It was the largest air battle Foss had ever seen. Zeros everywhere. Wildcats twisting through smoke fire and tracer rounds. There were no clean formations, no room for hesitation. Foss's vision blurred. His head pounded, but his hands moved on instinct. He wasn't thinking about tactics or doctrine anymore. He was hunting. He saw a zero lining up behind a wingman and rolled without hesitation. Foss didn't aim at the aircraft. He aimed at the future empty sky ahead of it and fired. The Japanese pilot committed to the turn and flew straight into the burst. The Zero came apart in midair. That was kill number 24. Seconds later, another Zero dove in confident, trying to bleed the Wildcat into a losing turn. Foss refused the bait. He climbed high, rolled over the top, and dropped out of the blind spot. One short, controlled burst. The engine detonated. The aircraft spiraled down. Kill number 25. Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary record was now tied. Foss didn't stop. Through the chaos, he spotted a Japanese float fighter trying to escape, clawing upward in a desperate climb. This was the final test, the veteran pilot versus the farmer's eye. Foss calculated speed, angle, and intent in a heartbeat and fired a long deflection shot into open sky. A second later, the rounds met the cockpit. The aircraft folded and vanished into the Pacific. Kill number 26. When Foss landed at Henderson Field, the entire base was waiting. The graveyard had become a place of victory. Men lifted the fever-racked farm boy from his cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. In a single afternoon, flying an inferior aircraft while half delirious with malaria, Joe Foss had shattered the myth of the Zero. The sky over Guadalcanal would never be the same again. While Henderson Field erupted in celebration, the mood hundreds of miles away could not have been more different. In Japanese ready rooms and carrier briefing huts, the story spreading through intercepted radio chatter sounded impossible. Veteran pilots returned from missions pale and shaken, struggling to explain what they had seen. Wildcats weren't supposed to fight like this. They weren't supposed to win. For months, the Zero had been king. Light, agile, untouchable. Japanese doctrine was built on certainty, force the American plane into a turn, slide onto its tail, finish the kill. It had worked everywhere. China, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines. Guadalcanal was supposed to be no different. Then Joe Foss happened. Pilots began reporting the same strange phenomenon. They would dive on a Wildcat, expecting it to flee. It wouldn't. They would bait it into a turn, confident they had the advantage. Instead, the American plane would do something that made no sense, rolling, early climbing, oddly firing at empty sky. And then a heartbeat later, a Zero nearby would simply explode. It felt unnatural, like fighting an enemy who knew the future. The Zero hadn't suddenly become weak. The pilots hadn't suddenly become careless. What had broken was confidence, the belief that the outcome was predetermined. Foss had done what the Japanese high command feared most. He had proven that their greatest weapon was not invincible. The sky over Guadalcanal changed after that. Zeros no longer dove with reckless certainty. Attacks became cautious. Pilots hesitated. And hesitation in air combat is fatal. The Cactus Air Force felt it immediately. The hunted had become the hunters. Joe Foss didn't just rack up kills. He rewired the psychology of the air war. His deflection, shooting, his refusal to chase, his willingness to let the enemy commit first. These weren't tricks. They were lessons. Pilots copied him. Squadrons adapted. What began as a farmer's instinct became a new American way of fighting. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese pilots were afraid. They weren't afraid of the Wildcat. They were afraid of the man flying it. And that fear spread faster than any aircraft ever could. Victory didn't end the war for Joe Foss. It ended his body. Days after breaking the record, the adrenaline faded and what was left nearly killed him. The malaria he had been fighting in the air finally took control on the ground. The fevers returned harder, longer, relentless. Foss could barely stand. He had lost over 30 pounds. His skin turned sallow. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The same man who had faced Zeros and sharks without flinching was now being eaten alive from the inside. This time, there was no argument. The doctors grounded him for good. Joe Foss didn't leave Guadalcanal as a conquering hero. There was no parade, no cheers, no final flight. He was evacuated on a stretcher carried past the same runway where wrecked wildcats still lay, half buried in the dirt. The graveyard he had helped turn into a victory ground claimed its price anyway. Foss was flown from island to island, hospital to hospital, his body broken by the place he had helped save. Back in the United States, the nation finally caught up to what had happened in that distant patch of jungle and sky. Newspapers printed his name. Radios told his story. He was hailed as America's ace of aces. But behind the headlines was a man relearning how to walk without collapsing, how to sleep without shaking, how to live without the ski. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss stood in the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, praising his dauntless courage and extraordinary skill. Cameras flashed. History froze the moment. But Foss knew the truth. The medal wasn't for genius or bravery alone. It was for endurance, for refusing to quit when logic said stop, for fighting long past the point where his body had anything left to give. Guadalcanal had taken its pound of flesh. Joe Foss paid it willingly. And in doing so, he changed the course of the war in the Pacific forever. Joe Foss never went back to Guadalcanal. His war in the sky was over, but the war he had changed was just beginning to turn. What Foss left behind wasn't just a kill count. It was a way of thinking. Across the Pacific, pilots studied what he had done and realized the truth: the Zero hadn't been defeated by better metal, but by better judgment. Deflection shooting became standard. The THAC weave spread through squadrons like wildfire. Wildcats and later Hellcats and Corsairs stopped running. They started hunting. Guadalcanal had been the proof. The rest of the Pacific would be the consequence. For Japan, the damage ran deeper than aircraft losses. Foss had shattered certainty. Veteran pilots who once flew with swagger now climbed into their cockpits, cautious, second-guessing every move. The myth of invincibility was gone. And once a myth dies, it never comes back the same. The air war shifted, momentum followed. For Foss himself, fame was unavoidable, but it never defined him. He didn't stay in uniform, chasing glory. When the war ended, he went home to South Dakota, back to open land, back to the people who understood work without applause. He used his name not to elevate himself, but to serve. He entered public life, was elected to the state legislature, and in time became governor of South Dakota. Later, he helped build the American Football League from the ground up. Different arenas, same instinct: see the flaw, fix it, move forward. Through it all, Foss never spoke like a legend. He spoke like a farmer. He credited luck. He credited the men around him. He credited habits learned long before Guadalcanal, when missing a shot meant an empty plate at dinner. Joe Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, remembered as America's ace of aces. But his true legacy wasn't the number 26. It was the lesson he left behind. Wars aren't won by manuals alone. They're won by people willing to see differently. James McKenna saw a fatal flaw in a cable and fixed it with piano wire. Simo rejected doctrine and trusted iron sights. And Joe Foss, the farm boy who was told he was too old, looked at the deadliest sky on earth and decided to fight it like a hunt. Sometimes that's all it takes to change history. History loves machines. Names of planes, numbers of guns, charts, manuals, specifications. But wars are never truly decided by steel alone. They turn on moments when someone looks at the rulebook, sees the flaw, and refuses to obey it. Joe Foss was one of those men. He wasn't supposed to matter. Too old, wrong aircraft, wrong doctrine, dropped into the deadliest airspace on Earth with a plane everyone agreed was inferior. But Foss didn't fight the zero the way the experts said he should. He fought it the way he had hunted his entire life, by watching, waiting, predicting. By aiming not at what was, but at what had to be. That was his modification. Not metal, not wiring. A mindset forged on frozen fields in South Dakota. And he wasn't alone. Across the war, victory often came from men like him. James McKenna, the mechanic who ignored specifications and fixed a lethal flaw with 6 inches of piano wire. Simo the farmer who rejected modern optics and turned iron sights into terror. They weren't reckless. They were precise. They understood something deeper than doctrine, the cost of being wrong. Joe Foss paid that cost in fever and blood, in years taken from his body. Guadalcanal broke him physically. But before it did, he broke the myth of the zero. He gave American pilots something more powerful than a new aircraft. He gave them belief. Belief that the enemy could be beaten. Belief that skill and judgment could overcome technology. Belief that even in a flying coffin, a man who understood the hunt could change the course of a war. That is why these stories matter. Not because they glorify combat, but because they honor the individuals who carried it. Men who endured fear, pain, and exhaustion not for medals, but because quitting was never an option. Joe Foss went home. He lived his life. He served his country again in peace. But for 44 days over Guadalcanal, he rewrote the rules of air combat and proved that sometimes history turns not on orders from above, but on the quiet confidence of a man who knows exactly where to aim. And that is how wars are truly won. When the guns finally fell silent, Joe Foss didn't chase immortality. He didn't live in the past or cling to the sky that had nearly killed him. Like most men who truly understand war, he stepped away from it. He went home, back to South Dakota, back to wide horizons and honest work. The same land that had taught him patience, prediction, and grit welcomed him back without ceremony. Foss carried fame, but he never wore it loudly. To him, heroism wasn't something you talked about. It was something you survived. America, however, hadn't forgotten. He was invited to speak, to inspire, to represent a generation that had endured the impossible. Foss accepted the responsibility not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of cost. He entered public service, serving in the South Dakota legislature then as governor. Later, he helped build the American Football League, another fight against entrenched systems, another arena where he saw flaws and pushed forward anyway. Different battlefield, same man. Joe Foss lived a long life, but Guadalcanal never truly left him. Malaria's shadow lingered. The weight of 44 days in the deadliest sky on Earth never fully lifted. Yet he never complained. He had seen what complaining solved. Nothing. When he died in 2003 at the age of 87, he was buried with full military honors. Flags folded, rifles fired, a final salute to America's ace of aces. But numbers fade, titles blur. What remains is simpler and rarer. Joe Foss proved that wars are not won by perfect machines or flawless doctrines. They are won by people willing to think differently when thinking differently is dangerous. People who trust hard-earned instinct over printed rules. People shaped by hardship long before combat ever found them. He was told he was too old, too slow, flying the wrong airplane, in the wrong sky. And yet when it mattered most, Joe Foss saw the future of the fight before anyone else did and aimed there. That is how legends are made, quietly. At 28,000 feet over Japan, a single B-29 was torn apart by enemy fighters. Engines gone, guns freezing, no escape. One 22-year-old gunner stood between 11 men and death while Japanese pilots chose to ram. 1. At 28,000 feet, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Oxygen frost crept across the plexiglass as the B-29, a square 52, clawed for altitude over the Pacific. Behind the Central Fire Control Station, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen crouched in silence, hands, steady breath, shallow. He was 22 years old. This was his 11th mission. He had never seen an enemy fall. Below him, 6 tons of bombs waited. Ahead, Tokyo shimmered under clear skies. Perfect weather for visual bombing and perfect conditions for Japanese fighters. Intelligence had warned them hours earlier. Dozens of interceptors were coming. Some would shoot, some would ram. Chen was the youngest gunner in the group, wired into 4 remote turrets spread across the bomber's fuselage. Twin .50 calibers. Revolutionary technology. Temperamental machinery. At 50 below zero metal, stiffened hydraulics slowed, oxygen mass froze to skin. This was how the mission always began. High altitude, jet stream winds, fighters climbing to meet them every time. By mid-January, crews were disappearing, whole airplanes erased in minutes. At 11:58, the formation crossed the Japanese coast. Radar found them instantly. Sirens wailed below, and at exactly noon, the first fighters lifted off to kill them. 2. The fighters coming for them were not desperate amateurs. They were specialists. The Nakajima Ki-44, called Tojo by American intelligence, was built for one purpose: climb fast and kill high. In under 8 minutes, it could reach the B-29's altitude where the air-thin guns froze, and men fought hypoxia as much as the enemy. Up there, one fighter could make pass after pass, slipping through defensive fire like a knife through fabric. And lately, some pilots weren't planning to come back. By January 1945, Japanese commanders had accepted a brutal equation. One fighter for one bomber was a fair trade. The bomber cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It carried 11 men trained for months. If ammunition ran dry, pilots aimed the airplane itself. Not kamikaze, just arithmetic. Chen knew this. Everyone did. At 11:58, radar stations on Honshu lit up. Tracks converged. At Narimasu Airfield, near Tokyo, engines were already warming. Pilots sprinted across concrete, climbed into cockpits, and shoved throttles forward without hesitation. 43 fighters lifted into the winter sky and turned southeast. Inside a square 52, the first speck appeared at 12,000 yards, just a dot at first, climbing almost vertically through broken cloud. Chen leaned into the optical sight. The dot grew wings, then the round cowling of a radial engine. Key 44. More followed. 3, 4, then too many to count. At 27,000 feet, the lead fighter rolled inverted and dove straight at the formation. Chen slewed his turret, the remote guns 15 feet away, responding through cables and cold-stiffened hydraulics. The computer tried to calculate lead and drift. Tried. The fighter opened fire at 800 yards. Tracers arced upward. Chen pressed the trigger. The guns hammered. The fighter snap-rolled and vanished beneath the formation. Too fast, too clean. No hit, no time to breathe. By 12:07, the sky was full of attackers. High side passes, diving slashes, brakes left and right at 400 miles an hour, and somewhere among them were pilots who wouldn't pull away. This was no longer a bombing mission. It was a fight for survival. 3. The call came sharp over the intercom. Fighter 2 o'clock high. Chen swung the upper forward turret. The sight steadied on a Key 44 sliding into a beam attack, nose locked on a square 52, 700 yards, closing fast. This one wasn't jinking. It was lining up careful, deliberate. Chen led the target and squeezed the trigger. 3 seconds. That was all it took. Armor-piercing incendiaries walked straight into the fighter's path. The Key 44 flew into the stream of .50 caliber fire. Its engine erupted in black flame. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke and fire into the clouds below. Silence for half a heartbeat. Confirmed, someone said. Chen didn't react. There was no time. 2 more fighters were already moving in. The right blister gunner opened up twin guns, hammering as tracers stitched the sky. Another Ki 44 slid in from 6 o'clock low. Chen slaved the lower aft turret to his sight and fired, missed. The tail gunner took over, raking the fighter's wing root. Aluminum skin peeled back like paper. The aircraft shuddered, flattened, and spun away out of control. 2 kills. The formation pressed on, but the timing was wrong now. The fighters weren't just attacking, they were coordinating. At 12:19, the bombers reached the initial point for the run. 6 minutes straight and level. No evasive maneuvers, no course changes. Every Japanese pilot knew what that meant. Above them, 14 Ki 44s formed up in pairs, orbiting once, twice, choosing angles. Chen counted them through the sight, jaw tight. This was the moment crews feared, the point where bombers became targets instead of aircraft. They rolled in together, pairs diving from opposite sides, forcing the gunners to split their fire. Tracers crossed and tangled. 1 Ki 44 flew directly into converging streams from 3 B-29s. Its canopy shattered. It clipped its wingman in the chaos. Both aircraft disintegrated in a mid-air collision. Fire metal, nothing left. But the next pair was already inside 500 yards. Muzzle flashes bloomed on their noses. Chen tracked the nearest fighter. It wasn't breaking off. No evasive turn, no pullout. This one was coming to hit them. He kept firing as the range collapsed 300 yards, 200, 100 rounds sparking across the fighter's cowling. Smoke poured out, but the Ki 44 kept accelerating. At 12:22 p.m., It slammed into a square 52's number 3 engine. The impact felt like a train wreck in midair. Metal screamed. The propeller tore free. The bomber lurched violently right as firelights exploded across the engineer's panel. They were still in the sky, but the war had just changed. 4. The bomber lurched out of formation, bleeding altitude and airspeed. Number 3 engine was gone, torn apart by steel and bone. Number 4 was losing oil pressure fast. Fire warning lights glowed red across the engineer's panel like a death sentence. Shut them down. Both right-side engines were feathered. Fire bottles discharged. A square 52 was now flying on 2 engines, heavy wounded, and alone. That was the moment every fighter pilot waited for. A crippled B-29 was no longer a threat. It was a prize. 3 key 44s peeled away from the main fight and dove after them, noses down, altitude and speed on their side. Doctrine was simple: finish the damaged bomber before it could dump bombs or regain control. Chen rotated the upper turret toward the first attacker, diving from 1 o'clock high, 1,000 yards. The targeting computer needed time 3 seconds to calculate lead on a maneuvering target. Chen forced himself to wait. 800 yards. Cannon fire erupted from the fighter. Rounds punched through the left wing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the slipstream, atomized instantly by the cold. 600 yards. Chen fired. The turret hammered through a 4-second burst. Tracers connected. The key 44's canopy exploded outward. The fighter rolled left and fell away, shedding debris. 5. The second attacker came in from 5 o'clock level. The tail gunner opened fire first, pouring 6 seconds of .50 caliber rounds into the oncoming aircraft. The key 44 flew straight through the tracer stream untouched. 400 yards. Then the tail guns fell silent, out of ammo. Chen slaved the lower aft turret. The controls were sluggish. Hydraulic pressure was collapsing across the aircraft. He tracked manually, guessed the lead, and fired a short burst. The round struck the fighter's wing root. Metal failed. The wing folded upward, snapped clean off. The aircraft cartwheeled and broke apart at 12,000 feet. 6. But the third fighter had been waiting. It slid into position at 3 o'clock high wings level, nose pointed directly at the cockpit. No muzzle flashes, no evasive movement, a ramming attack. The right blister gunner fired. Sparks jumped off the fighter's engine cowling. It didn't deviate. Chen swung the upper turret hard right. Mechanical stops screamed in protest. He fired missed high, corrected, fired again. Hits stitched across the fuselage. 100 yards, 50. The key 44 smashed into a square 52's number 1 engine. The propeller disintegrated. Shrapnel ripped through the wing. The fuel tank ruptured, gasoline spraying into the slipstream. The fighter broke in half pieces, tumbling over the bomber's back. Now there was only one engine left. A square 52 fell through 18,000 feet airspeed, bleeding away, wing-damaged rudder fighting them. And above 12 more Japanese fighters were already forming for the next wave. The hunt was far from over. 5. The bomber was dying. With only one engine turning, a square 52 sagged through 16,000 feet, the damaged wing dragging like an anchor. Hydraulic pressure was nearly gone. Controls were heavy. The rudder fought every correction. Inside the gun stations, the temperature plunged past 60 below zero. Chen's hands were numb. His oxygen mask had frozen to his face. Above them, 12 Kai 44s split into 3 tight groups of 4. Wolfpack tactics. One group would feint high. One would strike low, the third would hit wherever the defenses broke first. Against a healthy bomber, it was dangerous. Against a crippled one, it was execution. The first group rolled in from 12 o'clock high. Chen tracked the lead fighter at 900 yards. The upper turret responded slowly, hydraulics barely alive. He fired anyway. Tracers arced upward. The Key 44 jinked right too late. The second burst tore into its left wing. Fabric and metal peeled away. The wing folded, and the fighter snapped into a fatal roll. 7. The remaining 3 pressed in together, opening fire at 600 yards. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds ripped into the nose. Plexiglass shattered. A 20-millimeter round detonated in the bombardier's compartment. He was killed instantly. Chen didn't look. He couldn't. The targeting computer went dark. Hydraulic failure. No assistance, no correction, just instinct. He swung to the next fighter, let it by feel, and fired. The burst hit low. Sparks danced across the belly. The Key 44 broke left, trailing smoke probable. The third attacker dove nearly vertical 400 yards and closing fast. Chen fired a long burst. The barrels overheated despite the cold. Tracers walked into the engine cowling. The propeller stopped. The fighter fell past the wing and vanished into cloud. 8. The fourth came from 9 o'clock level. The left blister gunner engaged, but the Key 44 jinked, closed, and fired. Rounds tore through the left horizontal stabilizer. Control cables snapped. The bomber yawed violently. The rudder jammed hard, left. The aircraft commander fought it right. Aileron reduced power anything to keep them from spinning out of the sky. Chen tried to slave the lower turret. It rotated 15 degrees and stopped. Hydraulics were dead. The tail gunner took the shot. His guns purely mechanical hammered as the fighter pulled up from its pass. Rounds struck the tail. The rudder tore free. The Key 44 flattened into an uncontrollable spin. 9. A square 52 was still falling. 14,000 feet. Airspeed barely 140. Stall speed was creeping closer by the second, and the second wave was already inbound. Chen checked his ammunition. 15 rounds left. That was all that stood between them and the next attack. One engine, one gun, one last stand. 6. 15 rounds. That was all Chen had left in the upper turret. The lower turrets were dead. The blister guns were nearly dry. The tail gunner counted what remained in seconds, not belts. A square 52 was limping through 14,000 feet. One engine screaming at the edge of failure. The bomber slow, critically slow. 4 Ki 44s split into 2 pairs. They came in exactly as experience dictated. The first pair dove from 2 o'clock high. The second slid wide, setting up a follow-on attack from 4 o'clock level. They knew damaged B-29s still bit back. Coordination was survival. Chen tracked the lead fighter of the first pair. 800 yards. The turret moved jerky, uneven hydraulic fluid leaking somewhere behind the panels. He waited. 700. He centered the sight and fired everything he had. 15 rounds in one sustained burst. The tracers converged on the Key 44's engine. The propeller shattered. Smoke poured out. The fighter rolled inverted and dropped away, powerless. 10. The guns clicked empty. Chen's primary position was useless now. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled through the narrow connecting tunnel toward the rear, breath-ragged boots slipping on frost-coated metal. The right blister gunner was slumped in his seat, blood dark against his flight suit. Shrapnel had torn through his shoulder. He couldn't lift his arms. Chen took the position. No computer, no hydraulics, just manual controls, raw muscle against stiff, freezing mechanisms. The second fighter from the first pair was already diving. 600 yards. Cannon fire ripped through the right wing. Chen led the target, squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulders. Casings clattered into the collection bag. The burst caught the cockpit. The canopy exploded. The Ki-44 snap-rolled and fell away, spinning. 11. But there was no pause. The second pair came in from 4 o'clock level, 300 yards apart, firing as they closed. One aimed for the flight deck. The other targeted the wing root fuel tanks. The tail gunner engaged the trailing fighter. His last ammunition hammered out in a 5-second burst. Tracers walked across the nose. The windscreen shattered. The fighter pulled up hard, stalled, and vanished into cloud below. 12. The lead fighter pressed on. Chen swung his guns, but the angle was wrong. The blister position couldn't traverse far enough forward. He was blind. The left blister gunner fired his last 30 rounds. The burst hit the wing root. Fuel sprayed. The Ki-44 banked to escape, but the damaged wing failed under the load. The spar snapped. The aircraft disintegrated. 13. Silence followed. Not peace absence. A square 52 was still descending. 12,000 feet. The rudder jammed. The wing groaned under stress. And now the final 4 fighters were forming up behind them. These weren't setting up for gun passes. They were lining up to ram. Chen watched through the blister window as the 4 Ki-44s slid into a straight line astern, matching speed and altitude. No diving, no feints, just deliberate alignment. 4 fighters, 4 impacts, no ammunition left, no guns left, nothing to stop them. The lead fighter accelerated nose, centered on the bomber's tail. Impact in seconds. Then black smoke poured from its engine. The propeller seized. The fighter lost speed, fell away. The attack aborted by mechanical failure rather than fire. The Ki-44 spiraled into the Pacific, far below 14. The remaining 3 broke off. Fuel was gone. Time was gone. The sky finally emptied. A square 52 was still airborne, but just barely. 7. The sky was empty now, but survival was still far away. A square 52 staggered along at 12,000 feet, held aloft by a single engine that shouldn't have been running anymore. The radio was quiet. No escorts, no formation. Just one battered bomber alone over hostile ocean. Chen crawled back through the narrow tunnel toward the center of the aircraft. The damage report was brutal. 2 engines destroyed by ramming attacks. 1 shut down earlier from oil failure. 1 barely alive. The left wing was torn and flexing. Fuel leaked steadily into the slipstream. Hydraulics were almost gone. The rudder was jammed. The bombardier was dead. 1 gunner was bleeding badly. Distance to Saipan over 1,500 miles. Fuel endurance less than 9 hours. The math didn't work. The flight engineer proposed the only option left: restart the 4th engine. It had been shut down as a precaution, not destroyed. Without oil, it would tear itself apart in minutes. But minutes were all they needed. Extra thrust meant higher airspeed. Higher airspeed meant better fuel economy. It was a gamble measured in engine revolutions. The aircraft commander nodded. The engine coughed, shuddered, then caught. The bomber surged forward just enough. Descent slowed. They leveled at 10,000 feet. For the first time since Tokyo, The aircraft wasn't falling. Inside the fuselage, the cold deepened as systems were shut down to save power. Lights went dark, heating vanished. The temperature dropped toward -40. Chen dragged the wounded blister gunner into a more sheltered position and wrapped him in his own heated liner. The heating elements still worked, battery powered. It was all he had to give. Minutes passed, then 28. The restarted engine failed exactly as predicted, seized, solid propeller frozen, feathered, gone, back to one engine. Altitude bled away again. A new plan surfaced, briefly ditched near a Japanese-held island where submarines sometimes rescued downed crews. The commander rejected it. A B-29 with damaged wings and a jammed rudder would break apart on contact. Survival would be luck, not planning. They turned towards Saipan. Hour after hour, the lone engine ran at the edge of destruction. Cylinder head temperatures glowed red. Oil pressure danced on the wrong side of acceptable. The engineer reduced power to save it. Speed dropped. Time stretched. One by one, systems went dark. At 1800 hours, the wounded gunner lost consciousness. At 2000, he stopped breathing. Chen tried to bring him back in air so cold, it burned lungs. After 4 minutes, the engineer quietly called it. They kept flying. At 21:45, runway lights appeared, small, distant, unreal. Saipan. Fuel gauges read minutes. At 2200, the engine coughed. Starved. Caught again. Quit. The bomber became a glider. Landing gear half deployed. One main gear stuck. They crossed the runway threshold too high, too fast. Touched down hard. Metal screamed. The aircraft skidded off the runway, tearing itself apart in sparks and dirt. Then silence. 10 men climbed out alive. The aircraft was gone. The mission was over. And against every calculation, they had made it home. 8. Dawn came quietly over Saipan. In the pale morning light, what remained of a square 52 sat twisted beside the runway. Burned, metal-torn wings, ruptured skin. It would never fly again. The bomber was written off as a total loss. Steel and aluminum had finally given everything they had. The men had not. 10 survivors stood on the tarmac wrapped in blankets, faces gray with exhaustion and shock. 2 were missing from the count. The bombardier killed instantly in the nose. The right blister gunner, who had bled and frozen through the long night despite everything Chen could do. Their names would be added to a list. A short report. Another line in a war that counted losses by the hundreds. No medals were handed out that morning. No speeches. Just medics' questions in silence. Only later did the numbers settle in. 14 Japanese fighters destroyed in a single mission. 2 deliberate ramming attacks survived. 1 bomber, 1 crew, the highest single mission defensive tally of the Pacific War. A record that would never be broken because no one would ever be placed in that situation again. For Robert Chen, the count meant nothing. What stayed with him were smaller things. The weight of frozen controls. The sound of engines tearing away. The way the sky went quiet after the last fighter turned back. The feel of a heated liner wrapped around a wounded man who didn't make it home. The war would grind on for months after that day. More bombers would fall. More crews would vanish over water and jungle. Tokyo would burn. Japan would surrender. History would move forward fast and loud. But a square 52 would fade into archives and after-action reports, its story nearly lost to time. That is how most stories like this end. Not with victory parades, but with men who did their jobs, survived the impossible, and went back to being ordinary in a world that never fully understood what they carried home. This wasn't a story about machines. It was about endurance, about fear mastered 1 second at a time, about a 22-year-old gunner who held the line when the math said he shouldn't, and about 10 men who walked away from a falling airplane because they refused to let go of each other or the sky that tried to kill them. Some stories don't ask to be remembered. They demand it. 9. Years later, when the war was over and the noise had finally faded, there was no monument built for a Square 52. No museum display, no famous photograph. Just a mission report stamped, filed, and buried under thousands of others. Another aircraft lost. Another crew partially accounted for. Another day in a war that moved too fast to stop and look back. But for the men who survived, January 27, 1945 never really ended. Robert Chen went home older than his age, carrying memories no parade could erase. He never talked much about the kills. 14 enemy fighters in one mission sounded unreal even to him. Numbers didn't capture what it felt like to sit in freezing darkness, counting seconds until impact. Numbers didn't explain the sound a fighter makes when it tears an engine off your wing, or how quiet the sky becomes when you're sure you're about to die. What mattered were faces. The bombardier in the nose, who never saw the runway lights. The blister gunner, who held on for hours and slipped away in the cold. The crew who kept working problems no checklist had ever prepared them for. That was the reality of high-altitude war. Not glory, but endurance. The B-29 program would be remembered for factories, firebombing, and statistics. But inside those aluminum skins were young men who learned in minutes what fear really costs. They fought not because they wanted to be heroes, but because stopping meant falling. A Square 52 didn't change the outcome of the war. It didn't alter strategy or rewrite history. What it did was prove something quieter and far harder to measure. That ordinary people, when pushed past every limit, cold fire, gravity, exhaustion, can still choose to stand their ground. One trigger pull, one decision, 1 second at a time. That is why stories like this matter. Because they remind us that World War II was not just won by famous generals or decisive battles, but by crews whose names were almost forgotten, who fought invisible wars thousands of feet above the ocean and came home carrying victories no one could see. If you're still here listening to this story, then you're part of keeping them alive. Not the airplanes, not the weapons, the people. And as long as we tell these stories, the men of a Square 52 never really fall out of the sky. 10. History remembers wars through maps and dates, through arrows on paper and numbers in books. But that isn't how war was lived. War was lived at 28,000 feet with oxygen freezing in a mask. It was lived counting bullets instead of minutes. It was lived knowing that the next shape in the sky might not pull away. What happened to a Square 52 was not unique because of the number of enemy fighters shot down. It was unique because it revealed something uncomfortable, something easy to forget. That survival was never guaranteed. That bravery was never clean. That victory often looked like simply making it home. Robert Chen didn't return as a legend. He returned as a survivor. One of thousands who carried memories heavier than any medal. Men who went back to ordinary lives after doing extraordinary things in conditions that stripped away every illusion of control. No soundtrack played when they stepped off the plane. No crowd knew what it had cost. And maybe that's why stories like this almost vanished, because they don't fit neatly into triumph or tragedy. They live in the space between where fear and resolve coexist, where machines fail and people refuse to. This channel exists for that space, for the gunners who froze at their stations, for the crews who flew damaged aircraft farther than physics allowed, for the men who made choices no one should have to make and lived with them long after the shooting stopped. If this story held your attention, it's because it wasn't about hardware. It was about humans under pressure. And if you want more stories like this, real ones, pulled from forgotten reports and dusty archives, then stay with us. Every like tells the algorithm these lives still matter. Every subscription helps push these stories into a world that's moving too fast to remember them on its own. Drop a comment. Say where you're watching from. Say if someone in your family served. These names deserve to echo farther than a mission report ever could. Because wars end. But stories like this only die when we stop telling them. And as long as we keep listening, the men of a Square 52 and thousands like them are never truly lost. 11. But the story of a Square 52 didn't truly end on the runway at Saipan. Years after the war, when classified files were finally declassified, a chilling detail surfaced, something the crew themselves never knew as they crawled out of the wreck that night. According to official USL Army Air Force's records, the mission of January 27, 1945 was labeled a tactical failure. The reason was brutally simple. A Square 52 never dropped its bombs. In the final report, the entry was cold and brief. Aircraft aborted, target impact negligible, no mention of 14 enemy fighters destroyed. No record of 2 deliberate ramming attacks survived. No acknowledgement of an 11-hour flight on one engine. Just a red stamp, aborted. On paper, they hadn't completed the mission. In statistics, they hadn't changed the war. In official history, a Square 52 almost didn't exist. But across the Pacific, Japanese records told a very different story. Imperial Army Air Force logs described the same day as an unusually severe loss. An elite interceptor unit was nearly wiped out in a single engagement. Veteran pilots failed to return. Certain ramming tactics were quietly suspended for weeks due to unacceptable attrition. Not because bombs fell on Tokyo, but because one crippled B-29 refused to die. A Square 52 didn't win the way history usually remembers victories. They failed the mission, yet forced the enemy to pay a price so high that doctrine itself was questioned. And that is the real reversal. A mission marked as a failure became an unplanned psychological blow. No medals, no ceremony. Just the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes history isn't changed by perfect victories. It's changed by people who refuse to disappear even when every calculation says they should be dead. And that's why this story deserves to be told one more time. 12. There is one last detail, almost a footnote, that opens an entirely different door. In the weeks after January 27th, American intelligence officers noticed something strange. Intercept missions over Japan suddenly changed. Fewer head-on attacks. Almost no ramming attempts. Pilots broke off earlier. Some formations never climbed to interception altitude at all. At first, no one connected the dots. Then a captured Japanese maintenance log surfaced. It mentioned a single bomber unidentified by name that had absorbed unacceptable losses and caused severe morale issues among interceptor units. Pilots had begun referring to it informally, not as a machine, but as a bad omen. Even more unsettling, several Japanese pilots reported engaging the same B-29 more than once in later weeks, an aircraft they swore should not have survived its first encounter. Same scars, same damage profile, still flying. American records don't confirm this. Officially, a Square 52 never flew again. But war isn't lived in reports, it's lived in memory. And memory is where things get complicated. Because scattered across debriefs, POW interrogations, and after-action notes are hints of other missions, other bombers, other crews, each with stories that don't quite add up. Aircraft written off that somehow returned. Crews listed as lost who reappeared weeks later. Engagements where Japanese pilots broke off without explanation. A Square 52 may not have been an exception. It may have been the beginning of a pattern. A moment when the balance shifted not through strategy, not through technology, but through something harder to quantify belief. Fear. The quiet realization that some crews simply would not break no matter the math. And if that's true, then this story isn't finished. It's only the first chapter. The first chapter. The first chapter. The first. December 3, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, 9:12 a.m. The train doors slid open with a metallic groan and winter rushed inside like a weapon. Cold air cut through the wooden cars as Japanese prisoners of war stepped down onto frozen American soil for the first time. They were skeletal, uniforms in rags, faces hollowed by weeks of hunger, disease, and fear. Since the first day they put on a uniform, they had been told the same thing. Capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation. To surrender was to forfeit the right to be treated as human. They braced for violence. They expected screams, blows, blood in the snow. Instead, they smelled food. Not scraps, not thin soup, but something rich, heavy, warm. Smoke drifted from kitchen chimneys beyond the barbed wire. The scent of meat and frying oil floated across the white ground, impossible to ignore. One prisoner whispered under his breath, "This must be a trick." At that moment, none of them understood what they were stepping into. They did not know this camp would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. They did not know that within hours their bodies would be fed, their wounds cleaned, their teeth examined. They did not know that the greatest shock of captivity would not be cruelty, but normality. Because while Japan was starving by late 1944, America was overflowing. Factories ran day and night. Supply trucks never stopped. Food, fuel, and steel moved across the continent in quantities Japan could no longer imagine. And here in the middle of Wisconsin, that abundance was about to collide head-on with men who had survived on roots, rainwater, and propaganda. This is not a story about battles or generals. It is not about victory or defeat. This is the story of a moment when hunger met plenty, when fear met order, and when soldiers trained to die rather than surrender discovered something far more unsettling than violence. Their enemy lived in a completely different world. And that realization began here, on a cold morning, at the end of a train line, with the smell of food in the air. The prisoners were ordered into formation. They stood stiff in the snow boots, too thin for the cold bodies shaking beneath torn uniforms. Some trembled from exposure, others from something deeper: confusion, fear without a target. They waited for the moment it would begin. It didn't. No rifle butts, no kicks, no shouting beyond clipped instructions. The guards barked commands, but their hands stayed at their sides. No one struck them. No one mocked them. That silence was unsettling. American medics moved down the line, not hurried, not rough. They checked pulses, took temperatures, examined infected cuts that had gone untreated for months. One medic knelt in front of an older prisoner and carefully unwrapped a filthy bandage from his arm. The wound beneath was angry and swollen. Instead of recoiling, the medic cleaned it, sprinkled sulfa powder, and wrapped it again with fresh gauze. The prisoner didn't speak English, but he understood care. For men raised on the belief that surrender erased all worth, this was deeply disorienting. They had been prepared for cruelty. They had rehearsed suffering. They had not prepared for procedure. Next came delousing. Their lice-infested uniforms were burned. They were showered, scrubbed, given new clothes, real clothes. Then came medical exams, thorough ones. A dentist even inspected their teeth. One prisoner muttered bitterly, "They care more for our teeth than our honor." A Red Cross official addressed them through an interpreter. His tone was calm, administrative, almost boring. He explained the rules: the Geneva Convention, food, shelter, letters home, work assignments with pay, no abuse. Many didn't believe a word. Words were easy. Actions would tell the truth. That night, they lay on narrow cots beneath wool blankets. The barracks were quiet except for breathing and the occasional muffled sob. Some men stared at the ceiling. Others turned their faces to the wall. "They're softening us," one whispered. "They'll break us later." Another voice answered from the dark. "Or this is simply how they live." That idea was harder to accept than torture. The thought that this wasn't an act, that the abundance wasn't staged, that the order, the food, the calm, was normal. By late 1944, Japan was starving. Supply lines had collapsed. Soldiers survived on handfuls of rice, sometimes tree bark. Malnutrition wasn't an exception. It was the rule. America was different. Not just stronger, structured, predictable, full. And the prisoners felt it before they understood it. In the warmth of the barracks, in the weight of the blankets, in the quiet absence of fear. Morning would bring the moment that changed everything. But already on that first night, something fundamental had cracked. Not their bodies, their beliefs. Morning came quietly. No alarms, no shouting, just the sound of boots on wooden floors and the low murmur of guards calling roll. The prisoners lined up again, slower now, eyes scanning faces, hands, rifles still waiting for the violence they had been promised. Instead, they were marched toward the mess hall. It was long, low, and warm. Steam rolled out as the doors opened. Heat wrapped around them like a shock to the body. Then the smell hit thick, heavy, unmistakable. Meat, not broth, Not ration soup, real meat sizzling on a grill. For some, it triggered hunger so sharp it hurt. For others, suspicion. Stomachs clenched, hearts raced. Men whispered to each other as if speaking louder might make it disappear. "This is where it happens," someone muttered. "They'll take it away." The line moved forward. An American cook stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, expression bored, almost indifferent. He dropped a hot hamburger patty onto a soft bun, added fried potatoes. Then he reached down, popped the cap off a glass bottle, and slid it onto the tray. Coca-Cola, bright red letters, condensation on the glass. The cook didn't look at them. "Move along." The tray didn't disappear. No one shouted. No one laughed. They sat at long tables in silence, staring down at the food like it was dangerous. One man lifted the bottle, sniffed it, then took a cautious sip. The sweetness exploded in his mouth, followed by the sharp bite of carbonation. He coughed, then laughed, a short, startled sound that turned heads across the room. Another prisoner picked up the hamburger with both hands. Grease ran down his wrists. He took a slow bite, chewed carefully, then his face collapsed. He lowered his head, shoulders shaking. "I forgot what fat tasted like," he whispered. Around the room, men ate and cried at the same time. Some hid their faces. Others stared at the walls, trying to understand what this meant. They debated in low voices. "They're fattening us to weaken our spirit." No another replied. "This is how they eat." That answer was unbearable. Because if this wasn't a feast, if this wasn't propaganda, if this was just an ordinary meal, then the war had been built on a lie too large to ignore. For the American guards, nothing was unusual. They ate the same food, drank the same soda. To them, this was procedure. For the prisoners, it was an earthquake. They finished in silence. Trays were collected, lines reformed. As they walked back to the barracks, no one spoke. That night, lying in the dark, a voice cut through the quiet. "What do you think your family eats tonight?" No one answered. Outside, the wind scraped against the walls. Inside, the realization settled in, heavy, inescapable. The enemy had not beaten them with fists or bullets. He had beaten them with abundance, and the war would never feel the same again. Days turned into weeks, not with drama, with routine. Wake up, roll call, work detail, lunch, more work, dinner, lights out. The rhythm settled in quietly, almost dangerously normal. The prisoners were assigned to labor crews, clearing snow from roads, repairing fences, hauling supplies. The work was cold and steady, but not punishing. No beatings, no starvation. At the end of the week, they were paid in camp coupons, money. With it, they could buy soap, writing paper, toothpaste, even candy, chocolate. The first time one of them held a chocolate bar, his hands trembled. In Japan, chocolate was medicine, something rare, prescribed, almost mythical. Here it sat on a shelf like bread. He broke off a piece and let it melt slowly on his tongue. The sweetness was so intense it hurt. He wrapped the rest carefully and hid it, unsure why he couldn't finish it. English classes were offered in the evenings. Some prisoners refused. They said learning the enemy's language was betrayal. Others went anyway. Survival had its own logic. They sat on wooden benches repeating simple words after an American teacher. Bread, table, window, family. That last word hung in the air. One night the teacher wrote a sentence on the board, "I miss my family." He asked a young prisoner to read it aloud. The words came slowly, thick with accent. When he finished, the room went quiet. The teacher nodded once. "We all miss someone," he said. For the first time since capture, the prisoner felt something loosen inside him. Not pride, not hope, recognition. But kindness was not universal. On a work detail outside the camp, an American farmer watched them with hard eyes. His son had been killed somewhere in the Pacific. When a prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat near his boots. "Should have left them to starve," he muttered. The guard said nothing. He simply ordered the crew back to camp. That night, the prisoners talked about it in whispers. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one said. "Of course not," another replied. "They're men like us." Inside the barracks, life found strange ways to continue. Men carved small wooden toys from scraps. They played improvised games. They told stories of home carefully, as if speaking too loudly might erase the memories. A young guard sometimes lingered by the fence after his shift. He carried photographs, his parents, his sisters in Sunday dresses. He showed them through the wire. The prisoners nodded. They didn't understand his words. They understood the faces. One prisoner drew a house in the dirt, a tree, a woman standing in the doorway. "Mother?" the guard asked. The prisoner touched his chest. "Ha ha," he said softly. The guard smiled. The moment passed, but it stayed. Still tension simmered. Some prisoners warned against softening. "Every smile is a trap," they said. "Every kindness weakens us." Arguments broke out at night. "What does honor matter if we don't survive?" one man asked. No one answered, because there was no answer that didn't hurt. And beneath the blankets, staring at the ceiling, many realized the most dangerous thing in this camp wasn't hunger or fear. It was doubt. By the spring of 1945, the camp felt different. Nothing had changed on paper. The same schedules, the same meals, the same guards. But beneath the routine, something was unraveling. Rumors began to circulate, carried in whispers and half-finished sentences. Tokyo was burning. Entire districts reduced to ash overnight. American bombers were striking city after city with no sign of slowing. The Philippines were gone. Okinawa was bleeding. Some prisoners rejected the news outright. Lies, they said. Psychological warfare. Japan will never surrender. They said it loudly, repeated it often, as if volume could turn it into truth. Others listened and said nothing. They had stopped arguing because the argument no longer mattered. Every day the evidence rolled past them in plain sight. American supply trucks moved through Camp McCoy like clockwork. Canvas-covered engines, humming tires, crunching over gravel, fuel, food, medical supplies, tools, crates stacked high, unloaded, replaced, sent onward again. There were no gaps, no delays, no desperation. Back home, scarcity defined everything. Rice was rationed by the spoonful. Clothing was repaired until it disintegrated. Soldiers were sent to remote islands with barely enough ammunition, barely enough food, and orders that assumed sacrifice would somehow replace logistics. Here, sacrifice wasn't needed. This country ran on excess. One afternoon during a work detail near the service road, a prisoner paused beside a parked truck. Its rear doors were open just long enough to reveal the cargo inside wooden crates, packed tight with glass bottles layered in ice. Coca-Cola, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Enough to supply bases scattered across the Midwest. Enough that losing a few crates would mean nothing. The prisoner stood there staring, doing the math without numbers. A guard noticed and smirked. "Crazy, huh?" he said. "We got enough coke to drown the whole Pacific." It was meant as a joke. It landed like a verdict. That night, the prisoner wrote in his notebook by dim light, careful to keep his body angled away from prying eyes. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as if carving the words into himself. "I believe Japan was the center of the world. Now I see we are only one small island." He folded the page and hid it beneath his mattress. If it was discovered, he would be accused of betrayal, perhaps worse. But once the thought existed, it could not be erased. The realization came in waves, in the warmth of the barracks, in the fullness of his stomach, in the predictability of tomorrow. America did not live day to day. It planned months ahead, years ahead. This war was not being fought between equals. Courage could not replace fuel. Spirit could not manufacture aircraft. Honor could not feed an army when the fields were empty and the factories silent. The equation was brutally simple. Japan was fighting with belief. America was fighting with capacity. Some prisoners reacted with anger. Their voices grew sharper. Their loyalty more rigid. Pride became a shield against despair. Others withdrew entirely. They spoke less, ate quietly, stared longer into the dark. At night, the barracks were different now. Fewer arguments, more silence. The kind of silence that comes after the answer is already known. They were still prisoners of war. But in their minds, the war they had been sent to fight, the war they had been willing to die for, was already over. They just didn't know how or when the world would admit it. Beyond the wire, the machinery of victory kept moving, and soon the news would arrive that would silence everything else. The news arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no speeches, no dramatic announcement. It came in fragments, passed quietly, from guard to interpreter, from interpreter to prisoner. A single word repeated until it lost all shape. Hiroshima, then another, Nagasaki, and finally the one word that ended everything: surrender. The camp went silent. Men sat on their bunks staring at the floor, the walls, their hands anywhere but at each other. Some wept openly. Others clenched their fists until their knuckles whitened. A few shook with anger or grief or something that could not yet be named. There was no celebration from the guards, no cheers, no triumph. The routine continued. Roll call, meals, work details. That steadiness was unbearable. For years, these men had been taught that defeat meant annihilation, that surrender erased all meaning. And yet here they were alive, watching the world continue, as if history itself had simply turned a page. One prisoner felt nothing at first. No shock, no tears, only numbness. His mother had lived in Hiroshima. He would not know her fate today, or tomorrow, or perhaps ever. The uncertainty settled in his chest like a weight that refused to move. Weeks passed. Preparations for repatriation began quietly. Red Cross officials returned. Medical checks were repeated. Clean uniforms were issued. Lists were drawn up. Names read aloud. Men packed what little they had. Wooden carvings, letters never sent. Small objects that had somehow survived the war intact. On the day of departure, they filed through the gates of Camp McCoy one last time. No one spoke. One prisoner glanced back at the barracks, the mess hall, the guard tower where a young American had once shown him photographs of his family. He felt no fondness, but he felt something else: confusion, gratitude, shame. He had expected cruelty. He had received food. The journey home was long and quiet. The Pacific stretched gray and endless. Men huddled together, thinking of cities they might not recognize, families that might no longer exist. When he finally stepped onto Japanese soil, the world he knew was gone. Cities reduced to ash. Neighborhoods erased. Hunger, worse than anything he had known as a soldier. His mother had not survived. He learned that from a neighbor 3 days after his return. For weeks he barely spoke. He worked clearing rubble, rebuilding walls, carrying stones from one place to another as if motion alone could hold him together. One evening a child approached him, thin, eyes too large for his face. "Do you have food?" the boy asked. The man reached into his pocket. Inside was a small piece of chocolate saved from the camp canteen. He had carried it across the ocean without knowing why. He unwrapped it slowly and placed it in the child's hand. The boy smiled as he tasted it. And in that moment, something shifted. Years later, when his own son asked him about the war, he chose his words carefully. He did not speak of battles. He did not speak of honor. He spoke only of food. "I learned," he said quietly, "that cruelty is easy to carry. Kindness is heavier." His son did not understand. But some truths are not meant to be explained. They must be remembered. The war ended on paper in 1945. But for the men who passed through places like Camp McCoy, it never truly ended there. They carried it home in fragments, in memories they struggled to explain, in questions that had no safe answers. Some spoke cautiously, choosing their words as if they were still being watched. Others never spoke at all. Silence became a form of protection against judgment, against shame, against the unbearable complexity of what they had lived through. Because how do you explain that the enemy fed you better than your own army ever could? How do you reconcile loyalty with gratitude? How do you return to a ruined homeland carrying memories of warmth, order, and full stomachs behind barbed wire? For many, those memories felt like betrayal. They rebuilt cities from ash, raised families, learned to survive in a country stripped bare. Outwardly, life moved forward. Inwardly, something remained unresolved. They remembered the taste of a hamburger, the sting of carbonation, the shock of sweetness, not as comfort, but as contradiction. Years passed, decades. The world changed. The war became history, dates in textbooks, grainy footage, numbers too large to feel real. But the small moments endured. A medic kneeling in the snow, a guard showing faded photographs, a piece of chocolate saved for no clear reason. These were not acts of strategy. They were not calculated gestures. They were human. And that is why they lasted. One former prisoner once said that cruelty was easy to understand. You could fight it. You could hate it. You could build your identity against it. Kindness was different. Kindness forced reflection. Kindness demanded memory. Kindness stayed. The legacy of camps like Camp McCoy is not found in treaties or victory parades. It lives in the quiet, uncomfortable space where enemies briefly saw each other not as symbols, but as people. Those moments did not end the war. They did not erase suffering. They did not undo loss. But they survived it. And in a century defined by destruction on an industrial scale, that survival matters. Because war strips men of rank, of certainty, of hope. It turns nations into abstractions and people into targets. Yet even there, even at the lowest point, small acts of humanity endured. A meal, a blanket, a word spoken without hate. They remind us that history is not only shaped by those who command armies, but by those who choose restraint when cruelty is easier. These moments rarely make headlines. They do not fit neatly into myths of victory or defeat, but they outlast the noise of cannons and the silence that follows. And they ask a question that echoes long after the war is over. If humanity could survive there, what excuse do we have to lose it now? That is the legacy. And that is the story worth remembering. For many of the men who returned from camps like Camp McCoy, the hardest part of the war did not end with surrender. It began afterward. They went home to a country that had lost everything. Its cities, its certainty, its myth of invincibility. Hunger was everywhere. Grief was assumed. Silence was expected. And silence was what they gave. Not because they forgot, but because remembering was dangerous. In post-war, Jevon honor was not something you debated. It was something you carried or lost forever. To survive as a prisoner was already a stain. To admit that the enemy had treated you with kindness was worse. It sounded like betrayal, so they learned to separate their lives in two. What happened out there stayed buried. What was allowed to be remembered fit neatly into the national story sacrifice endurance loss. Anything that complicated that story, anything that blurred the line between enemy and human, was pushed down and sealed away. Many never told their wives, never told their children, never told anyone. Because how do you explain that the men you were trained to hate fed you when your own country could not? How do you admit that a hamburger, a blanket, a quiet word across barbed wire shook your beliefs more than bombs ever did? In a culture shaped by shame, gratitude toward the enemy felt unforgivable. So silence became survival. It protected them from judgment, from accusations, from the unbearable question of whether loyalty had cost them more than it gave. Over time, that silence hardened into habit. Years passed. The war receded into textbooks and memorials. The official history grew cleaner, simpler. Heroes and victims, right and wrong, victory and defeat. But personal memory does not obey official history. It lingers in the body, in the taste of food, in the weight of an unspoken thought. Some men tried to speak decades later. Their voices trembled. Their words came out carefully as if still asking permission. Others never did. They carried those memories to the grave, convinced that some truths were too disruptive to release. Not because they were false, but because they were true. History prefers clarity. Memory is complicated. And so an entire layer of the war remained largely invisible, not erased, but hidden. A quiet undercurrent beneath the noise of battles and declarations. It is in that silence that the real cost of war can be found. Not just in what was destroyed, but in what could not be said. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that were shouted. They are the ones that were swallowed. And that is why for so long they never talked. August 1943. High over the Pacific, an American fighter pilot is seconds from death. A Japanese Zero is locked onto his tail, every escape option exhausted. Then in a moment of pure desperation, he does the unthinkable. He flips his aircraft upside down and dives straight toward the ocean. That split-second decision doesn't just save his life. It shatters the Zero's dominance and changes for air combat forever. This is the story of Richard Bong and the maneuver no one was ever supposed to survive. At 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Richard Bong was running out of time. His P-38 Lightning shook violently as 20-millimeter cannon shells ripped into the left engine. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. Oil pressure was dropping fast. Airspeed was bleeding away. Below him, the Pacific stretched out endlessly, cold, empty, and unforgiving. His wingman was already gone, spiraling down toward the ocean in a trail of black smoke. Bong was alone now. Behind him, a Japanese Zero sat perfectly on his tail, less than 200 yards back. Gun steady, angle perfect. The killing shot was only seconds away. Bong had been trained at the best fighter schools in America. He knew every defensive move in the book barrel rolls, scissors split, S chandelle. In the last minute and a half, he had tried them all. And every single time the Zero pilot matched him with ease. The Zero wasn't just following him, it was hunting him. Bong's altitude kept dropping as he fought to keep the nose up. Gravity and damage were winning. In maybe 10 more seconds, it would be over. Another pilot lost. Another number added to the brutal math of air combat in the Pacific. Then, with no options left and death staring him straight in the face, Bong did something every instructor had warned would kill him instantly. He rolled the P-38 completely upside down and shoved the stick forward. The Lightning flipped inverted and plunged toward the ocean in a screaming vertical dive. Blood rushed to Bong's head. His vision turned red. Loose gear floated up and slammed into the canopy. The engines howled in protest as the aircraft tore through the air under violent negative G-forces. No manual said it could survive. For 2 terrifying seconds, Bong was flying blind. When he finally rolled the aircraft upright at 12,000 feet, having dropped 6,000 feet in moments, the Zero was gone. Not damaged, not falling, just gone. Richard Bong circled cautiously, scanning the sky in every direction. He expected the Zero to reappear at any second, climbing back up for another attack. But there was nothing. No silhouette, no engine noise. No enemy. The Japanese fighter that had been seconds from killing him had simply vanished. Bong was gasping for air, his head pounding, his eyes burning from the violent rush of blood caused by the negative G-forces. At the time, he had no idea what had just happened or why it had worked. All he knew was that he was alive. What Bong didn't realize in that moment was that he had just stumbled onto a maneuver that would change the air war in the Pacific. Not through careful planning, not through new technology, but through pure desperation. Within months, what began as one terrified pilot's instinctive forbidden move would spread across American airfields from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. Fighter pilots began whispering about it in tents over drinks before missions. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't turn, don't climb, roll inverted, and dive. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand how completely the Japanese Zero dominated the skies in 1942 and early 1943. When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, they were stunned. The aircraft seemed to defy everything U.S. intelligence believed about enemy fighters. It could turn tighter, climb faster, and fly farther than anything the Americans had. In early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots were achieving kill ratios that felt unreal. For every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down, the Allies were losing 9, sometimes more. The Zero was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, it weighed barely 3,700 pounds empty, over a ton lighter than many American fighters. That weight savings came at a cost. The aircraft had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its airframe was built to minimum stress limits. But in a turning fight, none of that seemed to matter. At combat speed, a Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in under 16 seconds. An American P-40 needed more than 23. In air combat, 7 seconds might as well be forever. Every time an American pilot tried to turn with a Zero, the result was the same. The Japanese fighter would simply come around faster and slide onto the Americans' tail guns lined up for an easy kill. And American pilots kept dying because they were fighting the Zero on its terms. By 1942, American pilots were dying not because they lacked courage, but because they were using the wrong playbook. U.S. fighter tactics were still rooted in World War I doctrine. Pilots were taught to turn hard, tighten the circle, and outmaneuver the enemy until they could line up a shot. That approach worked in Europe, where German fighters were heavier and less agile. But in the Pacific against the Zero, it was a death sentence. Every time an American pilot tried to turn with a Zero, the outcome was almost guaranteed. The Japanese fighter would simply outturn him, slide onto his tail, and end the fight in seconds. One man saw the problem clearly. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, one of the U.S. Navy's most thoughtful tacticians, watched his pilots struggle and die, even in training exercises against captured Zeros. He became obsessed with understanding why. Thack studied the Zero carefully. He acknowledged its strengths: unmatched maneuverability, rapid climb, tight turns. But he also noticed something critical. The Zero's performance came from extreme lightness, and that lightness came with serious weaknesses. American fighters like the P-38, Lightning T, P-47 Thunderbolt, and the F-4U Corsair were heavier, faster, and far more rugged. They couldn't outturn the Zero, but they didn't need to. They could dive faster. They could absorb more damage. And their engines kept running under conditions that would cripple a Zero. Thack's solution became known as the Thack Weave, a defensive maneuver where 2 fighters flew in coordinated patterns, covering each other's tails. When a Zero attacked one aircraft, it would expose itself to the guns of the other. The weave worked. It saved lives. But it had limits. It required perfect coordination. It was defensive by nature. And while it helped pilots survive, it didn't give them a reliable way to defeat the Zero outright. What American pilots still lacked was an offensive answer, something that could flip the fight completely. That answer wouldn't come from a briefing room or a training manual. It would come from another moment of desperation high above the Pacific, when a lone pilot decided not to turn, but to do something no one was supposed to survive. The moment that turned an accident into a deliberate tactic came on April 7, 1943, over the Russell Islands in the Solomon Chain. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron was flying a P-38 Lightning when his flight was jumped by 8 Japanese Zeros attacking from above. In the chaos of the initial merge, Lynch became separated from his wingman. Suddenly, he was alone at 20,000 feet with multiple enemy fighters trying to get onto his tail. Lynch was no rookie. He was a pre-war pilot flying combat missions almost daily since Pearl Harbor. He knew exactly how these fights usually ended. If he tried to turn, he would die. If he tried to climb, he would die. Even running away in level flight wouldn't work. The Zeros would catch him before he could build enough speed. He needed to break contact immediately. But every standard escape maneuver required turning. So Lynch made a decision that went against everything he had been taught. He rolled his P-38 completely upside down and pushed the stick forward. The world flipped. The ocean rushed up toward the canopy. Blood surged into his head as the aircraft plunged into a violent inverted vertical dive. His vision began to redden under the crushing negative G-forces. And then, something incredible happened. The Zeros couldn't follow. When the Japanese pilots tried to roll inverted and dive after him, their aircraft began to shudder. Their lightweight airframes strained under forces they were never designed to handle. Worse, their engines started to sputter as fuel flow broke down under negative G. Some of the Zero engines quit entirely. Lynch's P-38, heavier, faster, and built to survive punishment, screamed downward with increasing speed. At 12,000 feet, he rolled upright and pulled back hard, converting that speed into altitude. In seconds, the fight had completely reversed. Now the Zeros were below him, slower, scattered, confused. Lynch dove back down from above. His .50 caliber machine guns converged on a Zero that never saw him coming. It disintegrated under the burst. He destroyed another moments later. When Lynch landed, his face was covered in tiny red dots, burst blood vessels caused by the negative G-forces. His eyes were bloodshot. His head throbbed with pain that would last for days. But he was alive. And more importantly, he knew something now. That night, sitting with other pilots, Lynch told them exactly what had happened. Flying inverted wasn't suicide. The Zero physically couldn't follow. The maneuver wasn't just an escape, it was a trap. What had started as a desperate survival move was now a weapon. And word like that spreads fast among fighter pilots. What Lynch had discovered wasn't magic. It was physics. In normal flight, gravity pulls a pilot downward at 1G. When a fighter dives by, pulling back on the stick, the aircraft generates positive G-forces, pressing the pilot deeper into the seat. Fighter pilots train constantly to handle this tightening muscles, controlling breathing, staying conscious under 6, 7, even 8 Gs. But an inverted dive was different. When a pilot rolled upside down and pushed the stick forward, the aircraft entered negative G. Instead of being pushed into the seat, the pilot was pulled upward. Blood rushed toward the head. Vision darkened or turned red as blood flooded the eyes. Even 2 or 3 negative Gs could be unbearable. It was painful, disorienting, and dangerous. But for a few seconds, a trained pilot could survive it. Aircraft engines, however, could not. Japanese Zeros used carburetors designed for positive G flight, where fuel flowed downward from tanks mounted above the engine. When the aircraft went inverted and negative G hit, gravity pulled fuel away from the carburetor intake. The result was immediate. Engines sputtered, power dropped, and in many cases, the engine simply quit. The Zero didn't stall because of pilot skill. It stalled because fuel stopped reaching the engine. American fighters had a critical advantage. Aircraft like the P-38 used fuel injection, which delivered fuel under pressure instead of relying on gravity. That meant the engines kept running upright, inverted climbing, or diving. So when an American pilot rolled upside down and dove, his aircraft accelerated. When a Zero tried to follow, its engine betrayed it. This was the heart of the breakthrough. The inverted dive didn't just help pilots escape. It forced the Zero to give up the chase, leaving it slow, vulnerable, and often helpless, while the American fighter built massive speed. That speed could then be converted into altitude, and altitude meant control. What had once been a desperate survival move was now a repeatable formula: escape, speed, altitude, attack. It was brutal, it was effective, and it completely rewrote the rules of air combat in the Pacific. The tactic didn't spread through manuals or official orders. It spread the way fighter pilot knowledge always had, through word of mouth. Veterans talked, rookies listened, and the message was always the same. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't turn. Roll inverted and dive. At first, the maneuver had different names. Some called it the inverted escape. Others referred to it as a negative G dive. In formal reports, it was sometimes described as a variation of the split S. But among pilots, the language was simpler. Go upside down on them. Despite warnings in training manuals about the dangers of inverted flight, pilots kept using it because it worked. Across the Pacific, American fighter squadrons began incorporating the tactic into real combat. Pilots flying the P-38 Lightning used it most effectively, but it didn't stop there. The P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy and powerful, could dive even faster. The F-4U Corsair, with its massive engine, turned the maneuver into a screaming vertical plunge that no Zero could survive following. Kill ratios began to change. Where American pilots had once been outmatched 3-1, the number started swinging the other direction. For every U.S. fighter lost, Japanese losses climbed 3, 4, sometimes 5 aircraft destroyed. The Zero, once feared for its agility, now had a fatal weakness that could be exploited again and again. American pilots learned to bait Zero pilots into tail chases. They would deliberately let a Japanese fighter close in just enough to commit. Then the American would roll inverted and dive away. The Zero pilot trained to press the attack would follow and lose engine power, speed, or control. In seconds, the fight flipped. The American aircraft would pull out of the dive, convert speed into altitude, and come back down from above with every advantage. The Zero pilot rarely saw the attack coming. What made the tactic even more effective was its psychological impact. Japanese pilots had been trained to believe that once they were on an enemy's tail, the fight was over. Now, time after time, American fighters simply vanished beneath them, only to reappear moments later from above. Confidence eroded. Hesitation crept in. By late 1943, the Zero was no longer an unstoppable predator. It was becoming a liability, fragile, vulnerable, and dangerously predictable against pilots who understood energy, speed, and physics. The air war over the Pacific had entered a new phase. And for the first time since the war began, American pilots weren't just surviving, they were winning. The inverted dive didn't just change tactics, it changed psychology. Air combat isn't only about speed and firepower. It's about confidence, about believing you control the fight. In early 1943, that confidence belonged almost entirely to Japanese Zero pilots. They knew that if they got behind an American fighter, the outcome was almost certain. By late 1943, that certainty was gone. Zero pilots began to hesitate. Chasing an American aircraft now carried real risk. Any pursuit could suddenly turn into a trap, an American fighter vanishing in a screaming dive, only to return moments later from above with overwhelming speed and position. One of Japan's most experienced aces, Saburo Sakai, later wrote about his confusion the first time he encountered the maneuver. He described lining up perfectly behind a P-38, expecting an easy kill, only to watch the American flip upside down and disappear beneath him. When Sakai tried to follow, his engine sputtered and lost power. He was forced to break off the attack, helpless, while his opponent escaped. Moments later, the American was back diving from above. The hunter had become the hunted. Japanese training doctrine had no answer for this. Zero pilots were taught to win through turning combat, to exploit agility and climb. Nothing prepared them for enemies who refused to turn at all, who fought purely with speed, altitude, and energy. At the same time, Japan was facing another crisis. Its most experienced pilots, the men who had dominated the skies in 1941 and 1942, were being lost at a catastrophic rate. Combat attrition in the Solomons. New Guinea and the Philippines wiped out veteran squadrons. Their replacements arrived with minimal flight hours and almost no combat experience. These young pilots were being thrown into the air against Americans who had survived dozens, sometimes hundreds of missions, and who now understood exactly how to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The gap widened rapidly. American pilots grew more aggressive, more confident. They dictated when to fight and when to disengage. Japanese pilots, once fearless, became cautious, sometimes overly so. By 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific skies had fully shifted. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air superiority, was no longer feared. It was outmatched not by better dogfighting, but by better thinking. And the psychological edge, once firmly in Japanese hands, now belonged to the Americans. The impact of the inverted dive didn't end with World War II. After the war, American tacticians studied what had worked in the Pacific. The lessons were clear. Speed mattered, energy mattered, and trying to outturn a more maneuverable enemy was often the fastest way to die. The maneuver that began as a desperate improvisation was formalized into doctrine. The split S, a refined version of the inverted dive, became standard training for fighter pilots. Variations of the same principle were used in Korea against MiG-15s and again in Vietnam against agile Soviet-built fighters. In 1969, when the U.S. Navy founded its elite fighter weapons school, Top Gun, the core philosophy echoed the same lesson learned over the Solomon Islands decades earlier: fight on your terms, not your enemies. Use speed, use altitude, use physics. The legacy of that moment in 1943 lived on in every pilot trained to think in terms of energy instead of ego. For Richard Bong, the man whose split-second decision helped unlock that truth, the war ended in victory. He became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed kills. Other pilots studied his gun camera footage in awe, watching him calmly roll inverted dive away from danger, then return from above to finish the fight. He survived the Pacific War, but he did not survive the peace. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, Richard Bong was killed testing a new P-80 jet fighter in California. He was just 24 years old. Today restored P-38, lightning fly at air shows, occasionally performing the split S maneuver that once meant the difference between life and death. Japanese Zeros sit quietly in museums, beautiful, elegant, and fragile, no longer symbols of terror, but reminders of how quickly dominance can vanish. The Zero didn't change. American aircraft didn't change. What changed was understanding. The inverted dive was not a new weapon. It was not a secret design. It was the realization that the laws of physics could be more powerful than raw maneuverability, and that survival sometimes depends on breaking every rule you've been taught. History often turns not on grand plans or perfect machines, but on moments of desperation when someone is willing to try the impossible and lives long enough to prove it works. In August 1943, one pilot rolled his aircraft upside down and refused to die. And in doing so, he helped earn the tide of the Pacific Air War forever. The inverted dive may have been born in the piston-engine skies of World War II, but its lessons are still very much alive today. Modern fighter aircraft no longer rely on carburetors. Jet engines don't quit when pushed into negative G fly-by-wire systems. Advanced fuel management and reinforced airframes allow pilots to maneuver in ways Richard Bong could never have imagined. But the principle behind the maneuver hasn't changed. Modern air combat is still governed by energy management, speed, altitude, and positioning. Today's pilots flying aircraft like the F-16, F/A-18, or F-35 are trained not to outturn the enemy, but to control the geometry of the fight. They learn when to disengage, when to dive away, and when to trade altitude for speed, exactly the logic behind the inverted dive. Even beyond aviation, the same idea applies. Modern military vehicles, tanks, drones, naval vessels, missile systems are no longer judged only by raw performance. Sensors, networking, and tactics matter just as much as armor or firepower. The most advanced system can still be defeated if it's forced to fight in a way it wasn't designed for. That's the real legacy of the inverted dive. Not a specific maneuver, not a piece of hardware, but the mindset. Every modern military doctrine emphasizes exploiting asymmetries, finding what the opponent can't do, not what they do best. That thinking drives electronic warfare, cyber operations, drone swarms, and even space-based defense systems. The Zero was once unbeatable because everyone fought it head-on. It stopped being unbeatable the moment someone refused to do that. In today's world, technology evolves faster than ever. But dominance is still temporary. Every system has limits. Every advantage creates a vulnerability. The pilots of 1943 didn't win because they had better machines. They won because they understood how to use their machines more intelligently than their enemy. That lesson remains as relevant now as it was over the Solomon Islands. Because no matter how advanced the equipment becomes, victory still belongs to those who understand the rules of the fight and are willing to break them when necessary. In war, training is supposed to save lives. But sometimes it does the opposite. At the start of the Pacific War, both sides entered combat with confidence in their doctrines. Japanese pilots trusted the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, and the turning fight philosophy drilled into them from day one. American pilots trusted the lessons passed down from World War I: tight turns, closing circles, dogfighting skill. Both were wrong. Japanese doctrine taught pilots that once they were on an enemy's tail, the fight was over. There was no need to consider escape, disengagement, or energy management. The Zero would win because it always had. That belief worked until it didn't. American doctrine failed in a different way. It assumed every fight could be won by flying better inside the turn. Against the Zero, that assumption killed pilots faster than enemy bullets. What changed the war wasn't a new aircraft or a rewritten manual. It was the willingness of individual pilots to ignore what they had been taught when reality proved it wrong. When Richard Bong rolled his aircraft upside down, he wasn't following doctrine. He was violating it. When other pilots followed, they weren't being reckless. They were adapting faster than the system around them. The Japanese system couldn't do that. As losses mounted, Japan doubled down on the same ideas. New pilots were rushed through shortened training pipelines and taught the same turning tactics, even as American pilots were actively exploiting those weaknesses. There was no time, no structure, and no cultural space to question the fundamentals. Training became rigid. Doctrine became dogma. And dogma got people killed. The Americans made mistakes too, but they changed faster. They listened to survivors. They allowed unofficial knowledge to spread. They let experience override instruction manuals. In doing so, they turned failure into advantage. That may be the most uncomfortable lesson of the entire Pacific Air War. The most dangerous thing on a battlefield is not inferior equipment. It's unquestioned belief. History is full of forces that lost, not because they were weaker, but because they were too confident in what they already knew. The Zero didn't fail because it was a bad aircraft. It failed because its strengths locked its pilots into a way of fighting they could no longer escape.
March 3rd, 1943. The Bismarck Sea is calm at dawn. Admiral Kimura believes his convoy is untouchable. Then shapes skim the waves. American B-25s. Guns roar. Steel burns. In just 15 minutes, an entire division vanishes. The sun was just climbing over the horizon when the Bismarck Sea revealed itself wide, calm, almost gentle. Thin clouds drifted across a pale sky, and the water reflected gold and blue like a mirror untouched by war. On the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching his convoy cut clean white wakes through the sea. 8 destroyers, 8 transport ships, nearly 7,000 soldiers packed below deck. Everything was in perfect order. For more than a year, these waters had belonged to Japan. Convoys sailed under a shield of disciplined steel and experience. American bombers had come before high-flying B-17s that missed slow torpedo planes that died in fire. Nothing had ever broken the pattern. Doctrine worked. Training worked. Confidence followed. Below the decks, young soldiers from Osaka, Kyoto, Sapporo laughed softly, wrote letters home, and sipped tea as the ships rolled gently beneath them. This was just a crossing. The real fight waited on land. No alarms sounded. No sirens screamed. The sea felt safe. At 600 hours, Kimura raised his binoculars and studied the horizon. No enemy contacts. Good visibility. On schedule. What he could not see was that history was already moving toward him, low, fast, and deadly, about to tear apart everything he believed the sea would allow. Far to the south, while Kimura's convoy cut its steady path through the Bismarck Sea, the rules of naval warfare were already dying. In the choking heat of an Australian airfield beneath rattling tin roofs and clouds of red dust, American crews worked in silence. This wasn't a factory. It was a place where desperation replaced permission and where failure meant more men dying on distant beaches. At the center of it all stood Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. He was not a polished strategist or a desk-bound planner. He was a mechanic who flew a pilot who fixed his own machines, and a man who had seen too many bombers return empty while convoys sailed on untouched. High-altitude bombing didn't work. Torpedoes failed. And every missed ship meant another American grave in New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. So he broke the bomber. He rolled a B-25 Mitchell into a hangar and began tearing it apart by hand. The glass nose came off. The Norden bomb site, once sacred, was ripped out and tossed aside. Anything that didn't make the airplane deadlier was stripped away. Steel plates were welded into the nose. Then came the guns. 2.50 caliber, then 4, then 6. Finally, 8 long barrels jutted forward like the fangs of a machine built to kill at close range. The mechanics hesitated. There were no manuals, no orders, only Gunn's certainty. He recalculated the balance himself, shifted fuel, added counterweights. When the modified B-25 lifted off for its first test, the airframe trembled under the weight of steel and ammunition. At low altitude, Gunn squeezed the trigger. The sky didn't crack. It screamed. Shell casings poured from the fuselage like rain. The recoil hammered through the aircraft as if it were alive. When Gunn landed, he was smiling. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said quietly. "She eats ships." Word spread fast. What had begun as a gamble in a dusty hangar was about to meet its first real targets. And far to the north, Admiral Kimura had no idea that the sea he trusted was about to rise up and betray him. What Gunn had created was only half the weapon. Guns could shred steel, but ships were still hard to kill. To finish them, the Americans needed a way to put bombs inside a moving hull. That answer came from another quiet officer who was tired of watching failure from 10,000 feet. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had seen enough missed runs to know the truth. The Pacific was too wide, the weather too violent, Japanese captains too skilled. High-altitude bombing against ships wasn't courage, it was futility. So Ben looked down, not up. He watched waves break against reefs. He watched children skip stones across water. And one thought refused to let go. What if the bomb didn't fall? What if it skipped? At Port Moresby, he gathered his crews and explained the idea. Fly straight, fly level, fly so low the sea fills the windshield. Release the bomb at the last second and let it bounce across the surface once, maybe twice, then smash into the ship at the waterline. The room went silent. Everyone understood the risk. One burst of anti-aircraft fire at that height could tear a bomber apart. Release too early and the bomb skips away. Too late, and it ricochets back into the aircraft. They tested it anyway. Day after day, B-25s roared in over a wrecked cargo ship trapped on a reef. Propellers threw spray into the air. Bombs skipped wild, exploded short, or missed entirely. Aircraft were lost. Crews were shaken. But slowly, something clicked. Pilots learned the rhythm, the speed, the moment when sea and machine aligned. At the right height, the right angle, the bomb behaved like it wanted to kill ships. When one finally struck true, skipping once before slamming into the rusted hull and detonating inside the explosion, lifted the wreck out of the water. Watching from shore, commanders understood immediately. Guns' strafers would silence the guns. Ben's bombs would finish the job. Two reckless ideas had just fused into a single deadly doctrine. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a Japanese convoy sailed on unaware that the ocean itself had been turned into a weapon. By late February 1943, the pieces were finally in place. Guns, strafers, and Ben's skip bombers were no longer experiments. They were weapons. At airstrips carved from jungle and mud, crews trained until exhaustion blurred the horizon. They flew at mast height, 50 feet above the sea, so low their reflections raced beneath the fuselage. One mistake meant death. Precision was the only protection they had. The plan was brutally simple. The strafers would go in first, fast, low, and screaming, unleashing 8.50 caliber guns to rip open bridges, shred anti-aircraft crews, and blind captains at the helm. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close the ships would have no time to react. The entire attack would be over in less than a minute. No warning. No recovery. Pilots practiced attacking from the sun, from the wind, from angles that radar couldn't see and gunners couldn't track. Mechanics painted shark mouths and names on aluminum noses, ruthless, dirty Dora Hell's Angel, not for bravado but to remind themselves these machines were hunters now. At night, men slept beside their aircraft, afraid to miss the call. Then the call came. Intelligence confirmed a Japanese convoy was moving toward Leh. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, thousands of troops. To Tokyo, it was routine. To the men at Port Moresby and Eagle Farm, it was the moment everything had been built for. Maps were spread across briefing tables. Grease pencils traced approach routes over the Bismarck Sea. Armorers loaded belts of ammunition and set delay fuses by hand. In the early hours of March 3rd, engines coughed to life in the darkness. Rain misted the runway. Harnesses were tightened. Someone whispered a prayer. One by one, the B-25s lifted into the night, navigation lights blinking as they disappeared over the jungle. Far to the north, Admiral Kimura's convoy sailed on beneath a rising sun, unaware that the aircraft hunting them were no longer bombers at all, but something new, fast and unforgiving, already racing low across the sea. At 10 a.m., the first warning came exactly as Admiral Kimura expected. Lookouts spotted silver flashes high above the horizon, American B-17Ss glinting in the sun. Kimura lowered his binoculars, calm, almost relieved. This was familiar. High-altitude bombers. Predictable. Harmless. He ordered the convoy to maintain course. Anti-aircraft crews swung their guns skyward, loaders feeding belts as black bursts of flak bloomed above the ships. The sea thundered with disciplined fire. Every eye looked up. No one looked down. 15 miles away, skimming the waves at nearly 300 miles an hour, a different kind of aircraft was coming in. 12 B-25's noses packed with guns' propellers whipping mist off the surface. They flew so low, their shadows raced across the water. Sunlight flashed on aluminum fuselages as they rose just enough to clear the swells, then dropped again, invisible to radar, unstoppable to human reflex. Major Ed Larner led the charge. Through his windshield, he could already see the Japanese convoy, perfect formation, white wakes slicing the sea. He watched the flak burst uselessly far above and smiled grimly. The trap had worked. A shout went up on the destroyer Shirayuki. Aircraft low guns tried to swing down crews, scrambling in panic. Too late. Larner pressed the trigger. The nose of his B-25 exploded in flame. 8.50 caliber machine guns roared as one, a solid wall of fire tearing forward at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Bridges shattered. Steel buckled. Men vanished in sparks and smoke. Anti-aircraft crews died before they could fire a single round. The sound wasn't gunfire anymore. It was a mechanical scream, a force of nature ripping across the deck. Bombs followed, skipping across the sea like stones slamming into hulls below the waterline before detonating deep inside. Ships lurched. Fire erupted. Smoke clawed into the sky. Behind Larner, more B-25s surged, in each picking a target, each delivering the same brutal lesson. In seconds, the convoy's perfect order collapsed into chaos. And Admiral Kimura, standing on a deck suddenly alive with fire, realized the truth too late. The sea he trusted had just turned against him. The attack did not slow. It multiplied. As Larner's B-25 clawed past, the burning Shirayuki, 11 more strafers poured in behind him, each one diving into the smoke and fire like a predator picking its kill. The convoy dissolved in seconds. Destroyers swerved violently, throwing up white walls of water as captains tried desperately to shield the transports. It only made them easier to hit. One after another, the B-25s came in low and fast. Guns walked lines of fire from bow to stern, cutting bridges apart, shredding rangefinders, ripping gunners from their mounts before they could even turn their weapons. Men ran. Men burned. Commands were never shouted. There was no one left alive to give them. Then the skip bombers followed. Bombs slapped the surface of the sea, bounced once, twice, and smashed into steel hulls at the waterline. The explosions came from inside the ships. Transports split open like torn cans. Engine rooms vanished in fire. Ammunition cooked off in violent bursts that lifted entire decks into the air. The destroyer Arashio tried to interpose itself between the attackers and the transports, turning bravely into the storm. 3 strafers hit it at once. 24 machine guns raked the bridge in a single converging stream. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was gone. Seconds later, the crippled ship slammed into a transport beside it, both vessels locking together in flames. The air above the convoy became a furnace. Tracer fire stitched the sky. Oil spread across the sea and ignited, turning blue water black and burning. Sailors jumped overboard only to surface screaming as the water itself caught fire around them. From above, American gunners watched in stunned silence. Ships were exploding everywhere. Smoke columns climbed thousands of feet into the sky. What had been a disciplined formation minutes earlier was now a spinning mass of wreckage fire and men fighting the impossible. The entire battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, the guns finally falling silent, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The convoy was gone, reduced to sinking hulls, floating debris, and a silence broken only by flames and distant cries. For Admiral Kimura, standing amid the destruction, one truth was now undeniable. The old rules of war were dead. When the last American aircraft vanished over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into a silence more terrifying than the gunfire. Burning oil crackled across the surface. Wreckage drifted aimlessly. Where a perfectly ordered convoy had sailed minutes earlier, there was now only fire smoke and men in the water. Admiral Kimura stood amid the devastation, surrounded by heat and ash, struggling to comprehend what had happened. 15 minutes. That was all it had taken. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were either sinking or already gone. Thousands of soldiers, men who had been singing and writing letters at dawn, were now trapped below decks or thrashing in a sea that burned them alive. Survivors leapt from ships only to surface in flames. Others clung to floating debris, their uniforms soaked in oil, their voices hoarse from screaming. Some were dragged under by the suction of sinking hulls. Others vanished as secondary explosions ripped through ammunition holds. The sea itself seemed to rise and fall with each detonation, flipping lifeboats and bodies alike. Rescue attempts were desperate and chaotic. Damaged destroyers threw ropes and nets over their sides, pulling aboard the wounded with hands slick from blood and fuel. There were no bandages, no morphine. Sailors tore their own shirts into strips as the injured lay moaning on steel decks that were still hot from fire. Then the attackers returned. Low-flying strafers swept back across the wreckage, guns flashing again, not at ships, but at anything that still moved. Lifeboats shattered. Men in the water dove beneath the surface, choosing drowning over bullets and fire. For those who survived the first wave, hope died with the sound of the engines returning. By midday, sharks had begun to circle. Drawn by blood and vibration, they moved through oil-slicked water as survivors watched in helpless terror. Screams were cut short. One by one, voices disappeared. By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the nearly 7,000 soldiers who had left port, fewer than 1,200 would ever see land again. The rest were claimed by steel fire and sea. And as darkness settled over the Bismarck Sea, it became clear that this was not just a defeat, it was a warning. War had changed, and nothing that sailed in daylight would ever be safe again. When the first radio reports reached Rabaul, disbelief spread faster than panic. Officers read the message twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the meaning. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers lost, thousands dead. The convoy erased in a single daylight attack. Nothing like it had ever happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Not at night, not by submarines, not like this. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. In Tokyo, the report reached the highest levels of command. The language was blunt. No heroic phrasing. No tactical excuses. The truth was unavoidable. The sea lanes were no longer theirs. The doctrine that had protected Japan's empire for 2 years, speed formation, the umbrella of steel, had failed catastrophically. What shattered it was not a new battleship or a larger fleet, but aircraft flying so low they turned the ocean itself into a weapon. Emergency meetings were called. Maps were unrolled. Red circles spread across the South Pacific, marking the growing reach of Allied air power. Every major convoy route now lay within range of B-25 strafers. The conclusion came quickly and mercilessly. Moving supplies by day was suicide. The order went out across the fleet, no more daylight convoys. Troop transports were abandoned. Large formations were scrapped overnight. Instead, supplies would move in darkness, small ships, barges, submarines slipping along coastlines under moonless skies. It was a desperate improvisation, later known as the night run. It kept some units alive, but it could never replace what had been lost. An empire built on movement had been forced to crawl. The consequences rippled outward. Japanese garrisons in New Guinea and the Solomons began to starve. Ammunition ran short. Medicine disappeared. Malaria and hunger killed more men than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships, it was the death of logistics, the collapse of mobility, the moment momentum slipped away for good. For the Americans, the victory was quiet. No parades, no headlines at home. But among pilots and mechanics, the lesson was clear. Innovation had won. Improvisation had broken tradition. A handful of men in dusty hangars had changed the rules of naval warfare forever. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of fleets and formations. It had become a hunting ground. And after the Bismarck Sea, the hunters ruled the daylight. In the months that followed, the shock of the Bismarck Sea never faded, it spread. Every Japanese sailor who stepped onto a transport afterward carried the memory of what had happened in daylight. Crews whispered about it below decks. Officers avoided speaking its name aloud. The sea had betrayed them, and everyone knew it could do so again without warning. Convoys that once sailed proudly beneath the sun now crept through darkness. Lights were blacked out. Radios stayed silent. Ships hugged coastlines like criminals preying clouds, and night would hide them from the sky. Even then, fear traveled faster than fuel. At the first rumor of aircraft engines, men froze. Some swore they could hear the guns before they saw the planes, a deep, rolling roar that meant death was already seconds away. Reports from survivors painted the same picture again and again. The attackers appeared without warning. Too low, too fast, too close. Gunfire like machinery tearing itself apart. Ships exploding from the inside. Officers admitted their men broke at the sight of low-flying bombers' courage drowned by memory. Sailors began calling the B-25 the eight-eyed demon, convinced it could see them even in darkness. Inside Japanese headquarters, analysts searched desperately for answers. Charts and doctrines were rewritten, but the conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The enemy did not fight as expected. He adapted faster than tradition could respond. Discipline and bravery were no longer enough. The battlefield had become industrial, improvisational, unforgiving. For the Americans, the lesson hardened into doctrine. The B-25 strafer was no longer an experiment. It was a solution. Production increased. Tactics spread. Other squadrons learned to fly lower strike faster and vanish before defenses could react. The skies over the Pacific became a place of sudden violence, where control belonged not to fleets, but to whoever could think and move first. The balance of the war shifted quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of strategy maps. Japan still fought, still resisted. But something essential had been lost, the freedom to move, to supply, to breathe. From that point on, every mile of ocean was hostile. Every voyage was a gamble against innovation. The Bismarck Sea had not just destroyed a convoy. It had exposed a future where adaptation ruled, and hesitation meant extinction. And in that future, the sound of engines low over the water became the last warning many would ever hear. Years later, long after the fires on the Bismarck Sea had gone cold, the meaning of that day became impossible to ignore. What happened in those 15 minutes did not stay buried with the wrecks. It rewrote the war. Japanese planners no longer asked how to win battles. They asked where the Americans were not. Large surface movements vanished. Fleets hid by day and moved like ghosts by night. An empire that once ruled the Pacific now survived by avoiding it. The Americans drew the opposite lesson. Speed mattered more than size. Ideas mattered more than tradition. The strafer became a symbol not of brute force, but of thinking faster than the enemy. Factories adopted field modifications. New variants carried even more forward firepower. Pilots stopped talking about bombing runs and started talking about hunts. Airfields, harbors, convoys, nothing was safe if it could be reached low and fast. The sound became legend. Japanese sailors said it first as a warning, then as a curse, the roar of guns that didn't chatter but screamed. To hear it meant you were already too late. To see the aircraft meant you were already dead. Courage didn't vanish, but it was drowned by memory. No drill could prepare men for an enemy that arrived inside their reaction time. Across the Pacific, attacks multiplied. New Guinea, New Britain, the Solomons. The pattern repeated with brutal efficiency, sudden appearance, blinding fire ships breaking apart from within. Logistics collapsed under the weight of constant interruption. hunger and disease finished what bombs began. The war did not end in one place, it bled out everywhere. Historians would later argue over weapons and numbers, but the veterans knew the truth. The decisive blow wasn't steel or caliber. It was adaptation. A handful of men in a dusty hangar had proven that invention itself could be a weapon, and that once unleashed, it could not be put back. When the wrecks finally settled beneath coral and silt, the sea grew quiet again. Sunlight returned. Fish swam through rusted corridors where men once stood screaming. Above the surface, the Pacific looked unchanged. But beneath it lay the moment war became something colder, faster, and relentless. The Bismarck Sea was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, low over the water, guns blazing, and impossible to stop. The legacy of the Bismarck Sea did not end when the smoke cleared. It traveled forward in time, carried by the idea that an aircraft could be more than a delivery system, it could become the weapon. What began as desperation in a sweltering hangar became doctrine, then inheritance. In the years that followed, American engineers and pilots kept asking the same dangerous question: what if we push it further? The answer echoed through later wars. Transport planes returned to the battlefield not as lifelines, but as executioners. Side-firing guns turned slow aircraft into floating fortresses. Fire no longer fell from above, and it swept sideways, precise and merciless, pinning enemies to the earth with mechanical certainty. The strafer's DNA lived on in every gunship that stalked the night. But among the men who had flown the first B-25s, there was no triumph in the memory. They remembered the sea on fire, the ships breaking apart, men leaping into water that burned them alive. Major Ed Larner would later stand in museums staring at polished aircraft hanging silent from ceilings and say nothing for a long time. The planes no longer screamed, but he still heard them. On the other side of the ocean, the lesson cut just as deep. Japanese naval cadets studied the battle not as a failure of courage, but of imagination. Tradition had not saved them. Discipline had not saved them. The enemy had learned faster. And in modern war, speed of thought mattered more than honor or numbers. Today, the Bismarck Sea is calm again. Coral grows over twisted steel. Fish drift through passageways where soldiers once waited for orders that never came. Above, the waves roll gently, giving no sign of what lies beneath. But the wrecks are still there. So is the lesson. Innovation wins wars, but it always leaves ghosts. The strafer proved that necessity could turn mechanics into architects of history. It also proved something darker, that once invention is unleashed, it does not choose sides. It only accelerates destruction. And on March 3, 1943, in 15 minutes of fire and noise, the world crossed a line it would never step back from. Long after the war ended, when uniforms were folded away and the Pacific returned to blue silence, the truth of the Bismarck Sea refused to fade. Veterans from both sides spoke of it with the same uneasy pause, not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a moment when war itself changed shape. The B-25 strafer had begun as an act of survival. No grand strategy, no blueprint. Just men working faster than death welding steel and loading guns because waiting meant losing. Yet that urgency revealed something deeper. In modern war, invention was no longer support, it was the front line. Whoever adapted first would decide who lived long enough to adapt again. That lesson echoed forward. New aircraft were built around the same idea: durability over elegance, firepower over tradition. Planes designed not to intimidate, but to endure, to stay low, to stay close, to finish the fight face to face. The philosophy born over the Bismarck Sea resurfaced again and again, each time deadlier, each time more refined. But progress carried a shadow. For every engineer who admired the brilliance, there were survivors who remembered the cost. The sound of guns that never paused. The sight of ships opening like torn flesh. The sea burning. Innovation had shortened wars, but it had also deepened the abyss they fell into. Speed left no room for mercy. Precision left no room for escape. Major Pappy Gunn never lived to see how far his idea traveled. When he died years later, a note was found among his papers. It read simply, "We built them fast because men were dying faster. There was no pride in it, only necessity." Today, the wrecks still rest beneath the Bismarck Sea, pierced with neat circular holes where bullets once passed. Coral softens the steel. Fish move through shadows of corridors and gun mounts. From above, the water looks peaceful. It always does. But beneath the surface lies the moment humanity learned something it could never forget, that creativity can be as lethal as any weapon, and once unleashed, it changes everything. The sea keeps its secrets. History remembers the sound. Standing on the shores of Papua New Guinea today, it's almost impossible to imagine what happened here. The Bismarck Sea looks endless and calm, its surface broken only by wind and light. No smoke, no fire, no sound of engines tearing the air apart. And yet beneath those gentle waves lies a frozen moment, steel hulls, split open corridors, punched through by bullets, and the remains of men who never saw land again. Divers who later found the wrecks were stunned by what time could not erase. The ships were not torn apart by massive explosions alone. Their hulls were drilled through with hundreds of clean circular holes, each one the unmistakable mark of a .50 caliber round. Even decades underwater, the evidence was undeniable. This was not destruction from above. It was execution at point-blank range. For the Americans, the battle became legend. Proof that imagination could overpower doctrine. That a handful of mechanics and pilots working in a dusty hangar with no permission but necessity could alter the course of a global war. The B-25 strafer was no longer just an aircraft. It was a philosophy: adapt fast, strike hard, leave nothing time to react. For Japan, the memory carried a different weight. The Bismarck Sea entered naval education as a warning written in blood. Tradition without adaptation was a liability. Courage without flexibility was not enough. The sea they once ruled had become a prison watched by an enemy that learned faster than they could think. War moved on. New weapons replaced old ones. New battlefields claimed new lives. But the lesson endured. Progress in war is never neutral. Every breakthrough shortens the distance between decision and death. Today, coral grows where fire once burned. Fish drift through gun mounts and passageways. Above it all, the sea gives nothing away. But history remembers. The Bismarck Sea was not just where ships were lost. It was where the future of warfare revealed itself, low, fast, merciless. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The men who built the strafer never set out to change history. They were not chasing glory or legacy. They were racing a clock measured in lives. Every convoy that slipped through meant another beach soaked in blood, another jungle filled with graves. So they worked faster than doctrine, faster than permission, faster than the war itself.